El día de hoy, martes 15 de noviembre, estaremos durante este coloquio. Esta jornada termina el día de hoy. Tendremos dos mesas de discusión, donde la primera parte iniciaremos con la conferencia magistral de Sarah Williams. Continuaremos con la participación de Rasmus Doung-Grunnet, que se va a conectar vía remota. Después estaremos con Peter Krieger para tener un pequeño receso. Regresaremos con Nikos Katsikis para después iniciar con esta mesa redonda. Después habrá un tiempo para la comida que será de 1:30 a 3 de la tarde para continuar la tercera mesa de este coloquio, que será dictada o iniciada por Halder y por Schweizer del Colectivo Orangotango. Después estará de Jong de Titus Brandsma Institute. Después estará Paola Aguirre con Borderless. Y regresaremos después de un pequeño receso a la conferencia magistral de cierre con Eyal Weizman de Forensic Architecture. Terminando esto, también tendremos una mesa de discusión. Para ello, el día de hoy me voy a permitir presentar a los moderadores de esta mesa 2, titulada Procesos Descriptivos, que serán el profesor Daniel Dao y también estará Karina Arbizu. Ellos son los moderadores de esta mesa. Entonces cedo la palabra a Karina para que nos presente a nuestra primera conferencista, a Sarah Williams, y inicie de esta manera la mesa. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas.
Hola, ¿cómo están? Muy buenos días a todas, a todos, a todes. Me da un gusto enorme poder estar hoy aquí y es un verdadero honor poder presentar a la doctora Sarah Williams. Mi nombre, como dijeron anteriormente, es Karina Arbizu y quiero agradecer a la Facultad de Arquitectura por esta invitación. Y bueno, la doctora Williams, para quienes ya la hayan escuchado o conocido antes, pues es alguien fantástica que además ha logrado cruzar disciplinas y pues hoy nos hace una presentación sobre el trabajo que desarrollan en el MIT, en el Leventhal Lab. Si me dan un segundito, ahorita leemos toda su biografía. Gracias. Ella es profesora asociada de Tecnología y Planificación Urbana en el Instituto de Tecnología de Massachusetts, MIT por sus siglas en inglés. Es directora del Civic Data Design Lab y del Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism. Combina su formación en computación y diseño para crear estrategias de comunicación que expongan cuestiones de política urbana a audiencias amplias y generan un cambio cívico. Ella llama al proceso Data Action, que también es el nombre de su libro reciente publicado por el MIT Press. Fue codirectora del Laboratorio de Diseño de Información Espacial en la Escuela de Posgrado en Planificación y Preservación de la Arquitectura de la Universidad de Columbia. Su trabajo de diseño ha sido ampliamente exhibido, incluido el trabajo en el Guggenheim, el Museo de Arte Moderno MoMA, la Bienal de Venecia y el Museo Cooper Hewitt. Ha ganado numerosos premios, incluido ser nombrada una de las 25 mejores planificadoras de tecnología y Game Changer por Metropolis Magazine. Su última exposición en exhibición fue en la sede del Programa Mundial de Alimentos en Roma. Bienvenida, Sara, muchísimas gracias.
Hi everyone. It's really great to be here. I first want to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to join you today. As was mentioned, I am an associate professor of technology and urban planning at MIT, and I run something called the Civic Data Design Lab and the Leventhal Center. Are we on to slide? Perfect, okay. We don't have a clicker, so we have new technology. It goes like that. We finally invented it just now, today. Maybe we can patent it. But so I run the Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism, which is a multidisciplinary research center that really combines architecture, urban planning, media science, computer science, and the idea of the Leventhal Center is it's really through interdisciplinary relationships that we can create new innovations in cities. I'm excited to be the director of the Leventhal Center because I myself am very interdisciplinary. I'm trained as a geographer, an architect, an urban planner, and a data scientist. And I really combined my background in computation and design to create new strategies to create civic change. This is something I talk about in my book, Data Action. And data action is really a process for thinking about how we can use data for a tool for empowerment rather than oppression. So when I was reading the brief for this conference, this section really talked about the mass amounts of data that we now create in the world, and talks about how can we represent that information in a way that we can understand. And this is something I talk about all the time. Big data will not change the world unless it's synthesized into tools that have a public benefit. And one of the ways that we synthesize data is through maps. And I think that one of the things that maps can do is really reveal practices of power. And power is the ability to do work. And that's what maps do. They work. And I have this quote from Dennis Wood in The Power of Maps. And one of the ways that maps work is, we trust them, we believe them, we believe a map to be true, we associate it with that, right? And that makes it instantly work because we can translate data into a map to convince people of ideas. Maps also work because they humanize a particular situation or topic. They allow the person to exist in the space, in place and time, and to connect to that place. So they work in helping us connect also to the issues or problems. Maps work because they can create a dialogue. They allow us to understand data in a way that then connects us and allows us to generate different dialogues. So let's go to the next slide. But how do maps work? Which side of the force are they on? Are maps on the side of good or on the side of evil? And I think that maps actually can work on both sides. And it's really important for us to remember that that power exists. Maps can be used as a tool to oppress, just as much as they can be used as a tool for empowerment. And I think historically, maps have been used much more often as a tool for oppression. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is how we can turn data onto its head and use it for our tool for empowerment. So one of the things that I think is really important and one of the biggest powers that map has is the dialogue that it creates. And that dialogue to create civic change. So when I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today, I thought I would talk about the many ways in which the maps that I have made have created that dialogue and then have created policy change. So I selected a number of different projects from my own work. And one of the things that I think I'll start with is one of my oldest projects. This project has close to 18 years of impact. And I think what it talks about is the lasting kind of quality that an image can have, right? Once we put an image out in the world, it can continue to create change over time. So what do I mean by this? Let's go to the next slide. In this project, I worked with Laura Kurgan, who's an architect, Eric Kadora, who's a policy expert, David Reinford, who's a graphic designer, and myself, a data scientist and a designer. One of the things that I think is really important is when you're working with data to create policy change and building these interdisciplinary teams. And in this project, we took this data set. This data set is a data set that is taken when people come into the prison system. So this is actually when you are checked into the prison system, where you lived before you went into prison. And we wanted to turn this data on its head to expose some of the hidden patterns in the criminal justice system in the United States. So what we did next is added up block by block all of the people who were in prison. Here we're looking at Brooklyn, New York. And these red blocks show where over $1 million is spent to incarcerate people from that one block. And the idea here is to understand the data in a different way. What does it cost to incarcerate, rather than think about the systemic issues at play that put people in prison? Next. If you zoom in to those blocks we have highlighted in the previous map, you can see that it costs $17 million to imprison people from just these 17 blocks. On a financial scale, prisons become the predominant governing institution in these areas. Yet, they don't have proper education or job training programs or ways to alleviate the systematic associations with poverty that have created many of these reasons that people are within the prison system. So the idea of this project is also to think about one block. We can understand what the level of one block is and what $1 million on that block would be. Next. So we had a workshop where we showed these maps in Brooklyn, New York, New Orleans, New Haven, Phoenix, Arizona, and then we had a workshop where we asked people from the community where those 17 blocks are, and we said, what if you spent just $1 million in these blocks? How could we alleviate some of the systemic reasons for people going into prison? And here we see urban planners, people from the community, policy experts. Next. And together we created a systematic understanding of the space and made recommendations for how we could reinvest in these communities. Next. This group actually came up with something called the Dynamic Franchise Web, which was thinking about the multiple services needed. Many people in these communities don't have places to have childcare, but also have education. So can we have a childcare and education center? Next. The maps eventually ended up on the walls of the Museum of Modern Art, and you can see them here in the back. And the reason I bring this up is because one of the things that I try to do is really create that dialogue and bring topics to a broader public, right? So many people in the criminal justice system know the problem with mass incarceration, but how can we bring that topic to more people? So the maps were seen on the walls of the Museum of Modern Art by a congressman who next actually used them in the Criminal Justice Reinvestment Act of 2010 that allocated $25 million to reentry programs. So helping people who are coming back from prison and actually giving programs to them so that they don't return to the prison system. Obviously, $25 million is not enough if we see that those 17 blocks had 17 million, but it's a start. The reason I start with this presentation is we did this a very long time ago, and these maps have been used again and again in the current conversation in the US about defunding the police. Now, we're not talking here or advocating for defunding the police here, but what we're saying is reallocating money away from the criminal justice system into some of the issues that are systemic to poverty and associated with many reasons why people are going to prison. So people have reacquired these maps, used them for their own purpose and for their own advocacy. see. And I think one of the best things that we can do is when we make an image or a map or data or representation, and people leverage that data for their own needs. And so whether I agree with defunding the police, I do agree with reallocating funds away from the criminal justice system into the systemic issues. So this project has lasted over 18 years, and the maps are still being used to advocate for that kind of change. Next. The next project I want to talk about, and when we're talking about dialogue with data, is, shared data is essential for communicating the needs for policy change and generating a debate essential for that work. And data visualizations are really effective. So we talk about open data all the time and making data more accessible to the public, but not everybody can understand and comprehend that data set. And design allows us to understand that more clearly. Next. So in this project, again, I said it's really important in all my projects to build teams. I think building teams helps to connect the data beyond the policy arena that you're looking at. So here we worked with the World Food Program, the Migration Policy Institute, the Organization of American States, and the Inter-American Development Bank to look at the issue of migration from Central America, from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Next. So in this project, we interviewed 5,000 households from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and we asked them questions about whether or not they had a migrant from their household. Next slide. Here you can see one of our World Food Program colleagues interviewing the households. Next. And the survey questions included things such as food security, migration, intent to migrate, motivations to migrate, cost of migration, and the amount of remittances. We had over 200 questions that are asked, so it's actually a very big data set, even though it's 5,000 people interviewed. Next. And we began with this group to create a report. And this is the kind of standard report that they typically have. And while we felt like the impact of our study was great, this kind of report was not communicating well. And in fact, migration has been an issue in the United States for such a long time. Why aren't these indicators becoming clear to the public? So we decided, and we really encouraged the World Food Program and the Migration Policy Institute to think about a new way to explain this topic at a congressional hearing that we would have in November of 2021. Next. And they took the leap of faith. We designed a website and interactive data visualization to be used at a US congressional hearing. So while the report was released and given to those coming to the congressional hearing, we also allowed everybody to view this link and use this link to explain our findings. So let's go through it next. So it's no surprise that violence, climate, food insecurity, and policy historically have driven immigration. Next. And we started the website by contextualizing the story of migration within its larger history, looking at the reasons that migrants have come to the US in the last 60 years. Next. And one of the major findings is that we had in the report, and we really wanted to change the way that this story is talked about, and we really bring it down to the cost. And one of the things that we found is the sheer financial cost that migrants take. Next. Migrants, we found in our study, spent $2.2 billion in just 1 year to migrate from Central America. This amount of money is close to the amount that the US spends to keep people out on the border. Next slide. And yet, while migrants spend $2.2 billion to migrate, the U.S. benefits 73% of the U.S. agricultural labor force are made up of migrants. Next. But the U.S. Department of Homeland Security spent $2.9 billion to keep Salvadorians, Guatemalans, and El Salvadorans out at the border. Next slide. And even though migrants take on all the risks to migrate and the U.S. benefits, 57% of migrants never make it to their destination. Next slide. Yet, the countries in which they come from also benefit. What we found is that in this study, the majority of remittances go to provide basic needs. So previously, a lot of people think remittances go to adding a room to your house or adding infrastructure or roadways. At least in our study and the migrants that we spoke to, it was just putting food on the table. It was just putting clothes on the El Salvadorians' beds. And I think what's important here is it's providing a basic social service for the country. So just in El Salvador, 25% of the GDP comes back in remittances. So while the U.S. benefits, so do the countries in which the migrants come. Next slide. And it's no surprise that we found that financial insecurity really drives migration. Next slide. And we created a data visualization that allowed us to understand the economics, motivations, reunification, security, climate, other. But one of the things that we saw when we were looking at the motivations is that it was happening at all income levels. It's often thought that the poorest income levels are the ones driven to migrate, but actually we're seeing those migration coming at all levels. Next slide. So ultimately, at the congressional hearings, one of our major findings was that you need to create more legal pathways for migrants. The risk and burden is all taken on by the migrants, but both countries benefit. Next slide. And that's exactly what 33 US senators made a recommendation to the Biden White House, using our findings as evidence for their claims. So they wrote a letter to the Biden White House saying we need to create more legal pathways. Next slide. That happened in January, and in June, Biden did create more legal pathways for Central American migrants. So one thing people don't know is that there are many legal pathways for Mexican migrants, but for the Central American migrants, there have not been as many. So Biden increased the quota. Next slide. But I think what's important is, this project actually had the effect of changing policy, and we wanted to understand, did it have anything to do with the data visualizations? And so we asked people at the hearing, what was the effect? And one of the things we heard again and again is that the data visualization allowed them to operate with the data themselves. They were able to find their own insights, to actually connect themselves, humanize themselves within the data, and trust it. And I think it's this kind of ability of data visualization and to create that trusting relationship which allowed them to really understand the data in a different way. Next slide. So this is how we really take data to action. By building expert teams to collect unique data sets, quantify it uniquely, turn that data on its head and look at it through the cost, ground truth the data by working with the migrants, and open that data up through visualizations so that we can create change and iterate all along the way. Next slide. Since we did this project, the data visualization, we really also wanted a way to humanize the data. One of the things that we felt like is when we made this data visualization, the migrants weren't as connected to it as we would like. So since the release of the congressional report, we started to work with Honduran, Guatemalan, and El Salvadorian migrants to actually make a tapestry of their motivations. Next slide. So we created money to represent the $2.2 billion, and each piece of money represented one of the findings. So here we're looking at the fact that US depends on migrants and that 73% are hired crop workers. And this dollar bill represents clients. Then we looked at economics, next slide, reunification, and that migration is not a choice, next slide. The issues of remittances, next slide, and then the risks that migrants take on and the security along the way, next slide. And the migrants here wove the tapestry, and I think what's important here is they literally wove it with their hands and their own data, really trying to tell the story from their own perspective. Next slide. And they're using a Venezuelan money folding technique to actually create the tapestry. So if people are not familiar with that technique, the currency in Venezuela has gone down to make bags and other kind of wallets out of that money. And we created ultimately a tapestry of migrants' hopes, dreams, and motivations to migrate. Next slide. The tapestry went on view at the World Food Program headquarters in Rome as part of their executive board meeting. The executive board meeting has ambassadors from all over the world that are looking to donate to the World Food Program. And one of the reasons they wanted to have this on view is to bring attention to the issue of migration in a year where things were happening elsewhere and they were worried about the focus on the needs of the migrants. The tapestry, in fact, allows you to rip off one of the dollars and scan it on the computer screen here to see the individual story of that migrant. So each dollar bill represents one migrant's motivation. Next slide. So when you scan it on the screen, you can actually listen to that migrant's motivation, further humanizing the data visualization. Next slide. So one of the things that was really important about this was the dialogue that it created at the executive board meeting. And I think one really great way to understand that is the Honduran ambassador said, you communicated the migrant story with compassion, showing that many of them don't want to leave home but feel like they have no other choice. The World Food Program also was able to use it to raise a lot of money for migrants. Again and again, the donors wanted to ask about the tapestry, ask about the migrant experience, and they created a different kind of way of understanding the situation, not within the idea of crossing the borders, but actually the needs and costs of the migrants and how we can take care of them. Next. All right, so the next project I want to show you is how we can expose hidden systems. You know, using data, we can come up with unique ways to acquire, quantify, and model data that can expose messages previously hidden from the public eye. However, we must remember to expose those issues ethically and responsibly and not to do harm, right? So this gets back to my earlier conversation, is that math can do both good and bad, and remember to work towards not doing harm. And you can see in the previous two projects, I always expose hidden systems, but this one is particularly unique. So let's go to the next slide. Next slide. So in this project, we worked on ghost cities in China. And if you don't know what ghost cities are, they are large cities that lie vacant, but there are also small residential developments within larger cities that are mostly vacant. This is a kind of pattern that China has exported all over the world, creating these luxury buildings that people don't move into. And data about these vacant developments are not available through the government, because data is actually very hard to acquire in China. But understanding where these vacant developments are really important for understanding risk in the economics and of the real estate development in China. And so much is leveraged within that market. So in this project, we set out to create a model that helped us identify where these vacant developments are. And we thought thriving communities need amenities. We need a place to sleep, or a place to go to the grocery store, to the mall, beauty slides, a place to eat dinner. And if you don't have those amenities, you might be a ghost city. So we scraped data on amenities from the Chinese version of Yelp, and then we scraped data about residential developments from AMAP and Baidu, and created a 300 by 300 meter cell on top of all those residential locations. We then measured from the centroid of those residential locations the closest amenity, taking into account whether or not an amenity was something that people actually went to. So we looked at the reviews, and if you had a 0 review, it might not be something that you would actually go to. We took those distance scores and applied them to Hansen's gravitational model for urban accessibility, which takes into account if you live farther from a city center, you're more willing to travel a greater distance for an amenity. We created an amenity score for each one of those cells and then fitted that to the mean and created both cities. And we went and ground truth in Chengdu, Tianjin, and Xi'an. Next slide. So these are the ghost cities that we identified from our model in Xi'an. And here's what we found. Let's go next. Here we found places like this, next slide, that look like they were developed 5 or 10 years ago, next slide. And what the Chinese government would argue is that the financial and economics in terms of providing jobs is greater than the fact that anybody has moved here. So the fact that they were able to develop these places, provide jobs, and even though they lie empty, it's okay because of the job creation it provided. Next slide. We also found areas that look like this. Let's go to the next slide. Largely developments that have been stalled, next slide, next to existing kind of ghost cities, next slide, that lie largely vacant. And these developments, the only people who were living in them were actually the former villagers that got access to housing. But one thing to note is a lot of times these ghost cities are completely sold. So that's actually the case of this development. Even though nobody lives there, all the residents are sold out because before the Chinese stock market, the way to invest money in China was investing in housing. So part of the reason the ghost cities phenomenon has happened is because as people wanted to invest their money, they invested into these housing projects, even though maybe nobody lives there. Next slide. Then we found areas like this one in Area 3, next slide, which were former communist housing that were going to be ready for demolition and reconstruction. Next slide. And here you can see these empty buildings right on the waterfront that will soon be taken down. Next slide. Next slide. And then we found areas like this one, next slide, which are whole cities, next slide, that were developed, next slide, that nobody moved to, next slide. This is actually the Science Center. And what has happened here is that, the government has created this idea to have a jobs market here, but then they never brought the jobs or the schools, and so nobody moved there. But the investment in this place is thought to be greater benefit to China as a whole. Next slide. But I think one thing that's important about this project is when we, and I don't know if you can click to make the video go. This should be a video. There we go, thank you. And this is really, when you make a model, such as we did, and understanding that Hansen's gravitational model is not something everybody can understand. So what we try to do is create a data visualization that would allow you to understand the model. So here we can see that red cell was far from a mall, from a school. Why did they get the high score? And the reason I wanted to create these visualizations that explain the model was not just to say, okay, we've identified these ghost cities, do you agree or not agree with us, but also to say, what can we do to actually improve these areas through urban planning? So how can we actually create amenities that will make these places livable, or places that people might want to live? And then we showed this data, next slide, to the Chinese government. So one of the things that I think is really important is to ground truth your data. So you saw we went and ground truth our results to see if what we saw was actually happening on the ground. But then we actually asked people that are connected to this work more specifically. And I think what was great about the data visualizations is that the government officials were much more candid when we talked to them. They could understand the model and they could see the phenomenon. One of the things that this planner has told us is, you know, vacant developments are very controversial to local politics. And what she's saying is she knows that these developments should not have been made as a local planner, but she had little agency to make a change in that. Those kind of issues were coming from the top of the government to build, and she had to follow those directives, even though she knew people would not move to that area. Next slide. This planner was telling us how these decisions were mostly based on theory without the use of data. So kind of saying, you know, he has the data to say that these are the places that they should be opening up development, but they're not being listened to. Next slide. This real estate developer told us that the burst of the real estate bubble will carry irreversible impacts. And one of the things he was really candid with us about was the process. So many of these ghost cities, you know, the government and the bank are the same thing. So if a developer cannot pay back the bank, they can also not pay back the government, right? So one of the things that the government has been doing is opening up new land so that they give a loan to the developer. That loan then goes to pay back the previous development. And it's become a bit of a Ponzi scheme. And what was really interesting is exactly what he was talking about happened 1 year later in the Evergrande scandal in China. So if some of you guys remember, about 1.5 years ago, Evergrande went bankrupt, and it went bankrupt. It's a real estate development company in China. It went bankrupt exactly for this reason of the kind of creating of Ponzi schemes. So we had a more candid conversation about the economics involved in these ghost cities. Next slide. And really, we talked to academics as well, who told us that the mismatch between supply and demand geospatially is a big problem. So in this project, we were really attempting to expose this issue, have a conversation, and try to understand the economics of these cities in a different way. Next slide. So what we created was what I hope as like a foreclosure map before the actual foreclosure crisis happened. Next slide. And one of the things that my research lab does is we really want to bring these issues beyond the policy arena. So again, we created an exhibition, and here, in this exhibition, next slide, we connected the data to a map above that showed our ground truthing process. So when you click on one of the squares, next slide, you actually see that location in the ghost city. And so kind of trying to bring the debate around this issue to greater publics. Next slide. So the other thing that I want to talk about is the fact that maps can build trust. And one of the things that is really important in our work is this co-development of the maps and the data analysis. So in each project, we really build teams. And I think building teams is essential for creating the action you want to do with data, because each person in the team has their own network. And that broad network can bring out that information to diverse publics, but also really helps us understand the issue from diverse angles. Next slide. So in this project, I'm going to take you to yet another world city, Nairobi, Kenya. And in many rapidly developing cities like Nairobi, the situation on the street looks like this. Severe congestion problems. But one of the things, and I've been working in Nairobi for over 20 years, thinking about traffic and traffic issues. And when I got there was no information about the matatus. Those are these main buses, and they are the main type of informal transit in the city. And you know, they're really the public transport system. But there was no information about where these matatus went, and as I was trying to develop my transportation models, imagine not having data on 80% of the roadway, or 80% of the cars on the roadway. Next slide. So in this project, we're working with the Nairobi Computer Science Department. We developed an app to capture the stops and the routes along the matatu system. And I think it's really important that we worked with the computer science department in the University of Nairobi. We are MIT, we could obviously build that app, but we wanted the app to be built by the local community so that that app then can be used elsewhere and that the technology and the technological know-how stays in Nairobi. Not only that, they helped us make an app that people would use. Nobody, like, again and again, we heard them say, we wouldn't do that, we wouldn't use it that way. So they helped us make our technology more usable. Next slide. We created the data in a standard format called GTFS. How many people are familiar with GTFS? Anyone? 1, 2. That's the best. 3. That's a better statistic than I usually get. Usually there's only one person in the room, so this room is better. But you guys probably have all used GTFS. GTFS, when you're in Google Maps and you route yourself on public transport, the back-end data format is the GTFS format. So if you've ever tried to figure out how to get around on public transit on Google, you've used GTFS. Why do I stop and talk about this right now? I think what's important is whenever we're creating data, it's important to create it in a standardized format because it makes it instantly usable. There are so many open source softwares that use GTFS. It's not just Google Maps, but there's data and accessibility studies, and instantly your data becomes more than just a dot on a map, but something that has a meaning and can be more broadly used. Next step. So that's exactly what we did. We actually brought the community in Nairobi together. This is the local technology community. We explained what the GTFS format is, and we openly released the software. Next slide. And what happened is 5 apps were organically developed in Nairobi to use this data. And so apps that allow people to route themselves on the matatu, even a Waze-like app that told about matatu traffic jams and other kinds of problems. Next slide. And the maps eventually became the first informal transit system in Google Maps. Now there are many other systems, but this was the first one. We negotiated that with Google. Next slide. So when you think about the GTFS, it's really just a text file. It's an ID point, a latitude and longitude, and it's streaming into the system. And here you can see as the data comes in, it's building the streets of Nairobi. But we wanted a way for people who don't have digital technologies to also access this information. Next slide. So we started to think about how we could represent this data in a format that might allow us to connect it more broadly to formal transit systems. So here we started to create a map that looks like something that you would see in New York or Paris or Mexico City, London. Next slide. And ultimately created this map of the matatu system. And then we asked the matatu drivers, the matatu owners, and users to help us edit the map. And here actually what you're seeing is they're instantly using it as a planning tool because in the northern section of Nairobi there aren't many matatus, and there was a conversation of why that is. And this is the Matatu Union helping us edit the data. But we didn't just do it with the drivers and the owners. Next, we invited people from the city. Next slide. and actually invited people from the community to ask us if they understood the representational strategy of the maps themselves. So while we wanted to formalize the system, we also wanted to make sure that this kind of way of knowing is something that they would understand. So they helped us edit the maps. But I think one of the things that was really exciting is they did recognize its relationship with other cities, and it helped them to connect their city to those other global cities. Next slide. Ultimately, the maps went viral on the internet, and we had newspapers insert them. One of the things that you can see here, next slide, is, matatus are not, just in Nairobi. They exist all over the world. And since we've done this project, we've helped now 30 cities. The next slide, from Amman to Managua, have been inspired. Next slide. This is like digital, this new technology has some bugs, but we'll get there. The new Flicky print. Anyways, so from Amman to Managua have been inspired by our work. Next slide. And so now we have a network mapping these worldwide. I think one of the things that's really important is in our network for mapping this data, we don't go to every city, but rather we try to partner cities with each other. So we recently helped Santiago de Caballeros in Dominican Republic, and they had people who have done this work in Mexico City teach them how to make these maps. And so the idea is that the knowledge remains in the place, or knowledge from people nearby are helping them, and so that it's not always MIT coming to help, but rather we're helping bring that network together so people can get assistance from each other. So the other thing that I think is really important about maps is that they can change power dynamics, and building data helps us change the power dynamics inherent in controlling and using data, while also having numerous side benefits such as teaching data literacy. So in this next project, one of the things that I think about is the fact that right now Facebook, Google's, and other have more data than governments once had. In fact, they hold in countries like Kenya, where I work often, they have more data than the government has, making them in some ways kind of a more powerful because they have more ability to talk about the resources and control. And I really want to think about how can we take that data back from Facebook, take the big data back, and use it for our own kind of power dynamics. So next slide. In this project, we worked with Facebook and the telecoms to get an aggregated data. And what you're looking at are people. If you complete each one of those dots is a person, and I had data about how much they use the internet, how fast their download speed is, do they have 2G, do they have 3G networks, like how fast is that network, and I break that data into 150 meter by 150 meter grid cells, and this data came from a partnership that I made with Facebook's Data for Good group in order to show them and illustrate how they might change and use their data for something that has a benefit. Next slide. So we had things like user per capita, network diversity, character diversity, average signal wave, download speed. We connected all these data sets to create what I called a city's connectivity index, which would tell us in each one of those 150, 500 meter cities how connected people were. Next slide. And then in order to really enrich the connectivities index, we also needed to have information about the land uses, and that data we didn't have. So what I decided to do is actually try to use data that I scraped from Google Maps to do this. So like I did for Dan Ping, scraping the data here, we scraped data, next slide. Using a grid of fishnet points, next slide, to collect all the Google places, next slide. And we found the businesses that existed in all of those places, next slide. And then created a place density and diversity index, next slide. We combined that data with images that we got from Instagram that allowed us to better understand the place as well, next slide. And then ultimately created this land use map that we could connect with our city's diversity index. So here we're looking at yellow represents residential land, purple industrial, kind of red commercial, the kind of typical land uses. Next slide. And here, ultimately, we created a demand scenario for internet across Nairobi. And so it should come as no surprise that these very red spots are in some of the lowest income neighborhoods in Nairobi. Next slide. We applied the index to other cities. Here we tested it in Kampala. Next slide. And then ultimately, because Facebook has data everywhere, we were able to apply that index to many different cities across Africa. So let's go back one slide. Go back one slide. So one of the things that I'll just stop and note at this point is like what we really hope these maps would do is encourage both Facebook to increase connectivity because at that point they are the really people who are providing the internet infrastructure. What was disappointing is that they didn't actually want to do that. So they did want to create these maps showing data for good, but they actually didn't want to operationalize that because they were worried about the politics of them getting involved. And I'm still very disappointed in them. We could have a conversation about this afterwards. They have the potential to do so much good by releasing these maps to NGOs, to multilaterals, to actually show where governments could increase access to the internet. So, given this disappointment, I decided to take matters in my own hands, and in the next slide, I started to work with a group in Kibera, so one of those red hotspot areas that you saw. And I worked with an organization called Kungui Design Initiative. Next slide. So Kungui Design Initiative is a design firm based in Kibera that really co-designs public spaces. So they're taking some of the spaces in the informal settlements that might have been trash dumped or used in other ways, and then they work with community groups to really co-design those spaces. So taking those 12 different spaces that Kibera had, we decided to use those to create a wireless network. Next slide. So we co-designed with KDI a wireless network that could be community-owned, and then a data collection tool that could be community-built. So also, not only could they have wireless information, wireless access, but they could also have air quality sensors attached to those wireless networks to add Nairobi to the map. Next slide. One of the things that was really impactful about this project is we got the money right before COVID. So we already had the grants right like 6 months before COVID started. And so what we did is actually build this Wi-Fi network over Zoom during COVID to provide an essential resource to Kibera and this community. And here you can see our team working with us on Zoom to actually build the network. And again, one of the things that's important here is that the local knowledge stayed there. And I think it was really great that we couldn't come in a way because really they had to learn how to build this themselves. Next slide. And so one of the things that we created are manuals for the development. These manuals are now being used in other community-owned Wi-Fi networks. Next slide. We also installed solar panels to think about electricity. Next slide. And then with with the air quality sensors, we literally added Nairobi to the map. And so one of the things we often don't think about is the missing data that we have in the world. So, you know, if we don't have data, especially air quality data, we can't argue for the needs of residents. And so by putting these air quality sensors in Kibera, we were literally adding to that missing data and helping Nairobi connect to a more global market of data and information. Next slide. When people log into the wireless network, they actually see what their air quality data are. And these air quality information has been used by Safaricom to help donate new kinds of basically, they have something called M-gas, which instead of, because a lot of the reason the air quality is bad in Kibera is from cooking with coal. And so this data was used to help M-Pesa figure out where to give M-gas, which allows people to get a little piece of gas cooking, and they pay for that through their cell phone minutes. Next slide. So the value is not just the infrastructure development here, but the social development. The ability to co-design this network, to use the map, to investigate a place, but then use that investigation to give something back to the community and allow the community to give back to this global network and really change the power dynamics of who's collecting the information and who then can make decisions with it. So from Facebook to the community, we created something that we hope creates change. Next slide. So finally, I just want to leave you with this final thought. You know, all the projects that I've worked on, you know, data can be used for good and bad. And as we're collecting more and more big data in the world, we need to create our own ethical standards of practice. And remember that data are people, and we must do them no harm. And we must seek to develop our own ethical standards of practice and call on others to do the same. Next slide. And you know, while I feel like Google understood that in a way, and if you guys are familiar with the case of Timid Gabrouche, she was an internal critique trying to create ethical standards of practices with the inside of Google. But Google couldn't reckon with her findings, right? So while Google knew they needed to create their own ethical standards, they didn't know how to actually listen to their own conscience, right? In a way. So it's up to us to really kind of push and develop our own conscience and how data can be used and what are the proper uses for it. Next slide. Same thing happened with Facebook, right? There have been many internal studies within Facebook that showed that you know, some of their products were harming youth, yet they couldn't take their conscience and do something with it. So I want us to leave this idea that it's up to all of us working with data to create those ethical standards. And next slide, really take data to action and use it for empowerment rather than oppression. And one thing I want to also note here is, you know, in many of the projects, we had to reckon with these own ethical practices ourselves, right? You know, in the case of the Matatus, is exposing and making a map of the Matatus going to do more harm than good? You know, and in many cities that have asked us to work with them, we haven't mapped their informal transit system because it would cause negative effects by visualizing them. In the case of the Matatus, right, it helped us see them as a formalized system, get funding from multilateral agencies to help secure them. But in other countries, the very opposite could happen by visualizing that data. So one thing that's important is really when you're building teams to work with the data to understand those potential harms with the team. Same goes with the original project that I talked about at the beginning. You know, exposing where people live that are in the criminal justice system could have potential harm. And we debated that forever, the benefits and harm of that. But showing and exposing that we spent over $17 million in just one community, and seeing that, you know, spending that money could help alleviate some of the systemic issues, we felt like we were doing more good than potential harm. So I want to leave you all with that, thinking about how you can use data for action, turn around traditional data sets, take them and repurpose them for your own projects. Thank you very much.
Nuestro segundo ponente en el panel de hoy en la mañana, nuestro segundo bloque, es Doung-Grunnet, es uno de los directores de la oficina Eyal, una oficina de planeación y diseño urbano, cuya historia se remonta hasta los años 60. Es una oficina que tiene como objetivo diseñar y desarrollar ciudades más saludables, más sostenibles y más equitativas para la gente. Doung es director, como decía, de la oficina en Copenhague, uno de los directores. Trabaja desarrollando, supervisando proyectos en China y Alemania. Tiene experiencia de haber vivido y trabajado en la ciudad de Shanghái por 12 años. Tiene un entendimiento profundo de las complejidades culturales y sociales, lo cual le permite poder desarrollar los proyectos que hace él en la región, y tiene experiencia aplicando la metodología que ellos llaman la gente primero. Además ha vivido y trabajado en Bremen, así que también tiene experiencia desarrollando proyectos colectivos a través de Alemania.
Good morning here in Mexico. This is Ricardo.
This is Ricardo. Can you hear me?
Rasmus, can you hear me?
I hope that everybody can hear me. Can everybody hear me? Is the signal good?
We can hear you.
Alright. I'm going to go ahead. Okay, great. I'm going to try to next 35 minutes or so, talk a bit about mapping, how we do data mapping at Geo, where I'm from, and then try to bring that a little bit down on focus that I've chosen today to have something to share, something to sort of focus in on, and talk about how we do mapping of data, how we work with that at a local and in this case, child-friendly communities. There are many different themes that we work with at Geo, but child-friendly communities is definitely one of them. We're both having a sort of a lens today. So, just briefly, Geo, where I'm from, we are a studio based in Copenhagen with offices also in San Francisco and in New York, with people in quite many places. And at the core of what we do, we study human behavior, and a sort of extension of that, we shape competition for people, we shape people to thrive, and overall focus on making cities for people. We are a studio with colleagues that are trained as architects, that are trained as landscape architects, trained as anthropologists, and so on. Many different disciplines, and at the core we work with urban strategy analysis, we do master plan, and project facilitation. So we do a lot of different disciplines, are truly a multidisciplinary studio. And like I said, we are based in Copenhagen, New York, and San Francisco, and we also do work in these three cities and many other cities around the world. So one of the interesting things I think worth highlighting here is that we do indeed work globally. That's not just interesting to us because it's fascinating and sort of having a global footprint. It's more because we work extensively with collecting and studying and mapping human behavior in cities. And by working globally, we are able to connect results. We're able to compare what works and what doesn't work in cities in many places. At the core of it, the human condition is often comparable, and that case we can really learn from sites around the world. So we work in places like, very famously in Times Square in New York, when we work with the city about the whole transformation of Times Square, where before where it was really a square until after, and then the continuing development of public spaces throughout New York City. So like mentioned, we work with different disciplines, and we work with focuses. And we sort of have 3 steps that we very much focus on. We look at public life, and that's what we're going to talk a bit more about today. How do we understand behavior, and how do we work as social scientists and collecting data and mapping the human condition in cities? How do we apply this as strategists, like as in urban strategy, and then bring this towards the change-making process, towards urban design, where we make change through planning and design. That's how we work. At the core of this, which is interesting in this discussion about how we map and work with data, there's a sort of collection of methodologies and also tools that we use that we call the gear lens. Essentially, it's about getting a focus on and understanding the lived experience at a neighborhood level. How do people live in a city, at city level, but also at neighborhood level? How do we understand the lived experience? So we do this in many different ways. We do it by observational surveys. I'll come back to that in a second. We do interviews. In this case where it's done with food business owners. We do GIS mapping and place mapping. But at the core of a lot of this is a methodology and a platform that Eyal has been working on for many years. We call it public life studies. And ever since Eyal with his colleagues started academically to study and work on this, and since 2000, where Helle Søholt and Eyal, they founded the Eyal Studio, we've been working with this method across many different cities, doing so-called public life studies. Nowadays, we have developed this into a platform where we have an app we can use, and that we can provide to collaborators and other participants in projects to use. But essentially, we use observations and data collection to map the lived experience at a neighborhood level. It's across with other focus areas we have. We look at doing public life studies at a neighborhood level and understanding the lived experience of the city we're working in. So what I'll try to do today is to talk a little bit about how we have used this to do healthy and child-friendly communities. And these projects are not exclusively for health and child-friendliness, but I think they're interesting in the sense that gives us a lens to look at things. So first of all, we have a great interest in understanding how we can work at a neighborhood scale. Neighborhood scale gives us a possibility where we can get work with the gap between the city, which is quite the interconnected, very complex system of many different factors, and then all the way down the individual level, which is where we do a lot of our studies. How can we come out from this and find the spot in between at a neighborhood scale? We can look at building improvements, street improvements, and other kinds of focus limitations that we can use to improve the lived experience in the cities. And just some examples of where we've done this in many different ways. We've looked in London at working with reducing childhood obesity, where we have seen how much everyday habits, what do young people do, how are people using the city, how are they coming to and from school, is part of informing either a with giving invitations to either a daily human behavior that can support the reduction of childhood obesity or not. So we maybe you could look at the neighborhood scale to come closer at some insights and some findings about, for example, teenagers, how much time is spent on bus stops, commute from school, how much of that lived experience at neighborhood level is really centered around bus stop with fast food change, and that being maybe enhanced to improve the lived experience at that neighborhood level. We looked at another case study where we're linking quite abstract targets like around reducing CO2 emissions, and we look at everyday habits in food, how we use food, how we eat food, how we live with food at a local neighborhood, how teenagers and young people have a healthy food behavior that can be linked back to quite big and complex targets like CO2 emissions. And this is something that we've then been studying also using these neighborhood level habit studies. We've been using this to then also look at pilot projects, things we could try out, things we could test, and things we could do to improve this experience. What I wanted to do at this point was to zoom out and show a concrete example of how we do this. First, in one example, where we worked at a very, very large scale in the city of Shanghai, where we've been working, as you can see, the number of 15 pops up quite a lot. Looking at 50-minute local communities, using community guidelines to suggest how we can improve the experience. So what I'm going to do is we're just going to stop sharing this one, and then I'll share another screen I have here to explain to you how we convert this into findings at a project level. So this is full screen. That's not first. You cannot see my screen anymore, that's unfortunate. Let's try that again. Okay, so that didn't work. Give me 1 second and I'll fix this. It's always nice to have a little bit of an IT problem when we do these things. So, almost there. Coming back online now. We're sharing the screen and we're getting one. I think that should work better. So this is now see the screen. There we go. I hope you can all see my screen. If not, somebody can please shut up. So this is an example of how we take the lived experience and public life data that we collect, that we use it to inform a community neighborhood scale urban strategy with suggestions for how we improve the urban design and improve the city. So this talks a bit about how we do the mapping and what we get to map and how we come out of this with some lessons learned. So this is an area in Shanghai, so we just looked at a very large scale in the city of Shanghai. This is zoomed in, not even at a district level, but actually at a community level called the Xinhua Road community or neighborhood. And what we did here was that we took quite high-level focus from the city of Shanghai, focusing on the master, and they have their street design guidelines that we worked on their guidelines for how to work with all streets in Shanghai. And we zoomed in and we said, what are some of the most important elements here? The street is a public space, working with the street as the backbone of the neighborhood, and a lot of it on focus on health and also child friendliness. I'll come back to in a second. But this overall premise that streets comprise 20-25% of all city space, and maybe as much as 8% of all open city spaces in a city like Shanghai. And I think this is not far off in a city like Mexico City, for example, where we've also worked before on strategies. Some of the same things to be said to be true there. So we look very much at this thing where we measure, test, define, a very deep methodology. I won't go into it here, but understanding, measuring the urban conditions, testing our solutions, which we did here, and then refining them. But this one, what we did was we used a number of different kind of mapping techniques to understand the lived experience. We at the core of this was the so-called PSPL survey. We used the GEO methodology, the app that I showed before, where we measure movements in an area and stationary activities. What are people actually doing? Then we teamed up with a local partner, CSTC, and with support from Energy Foundation in China, and we used a app that has been developed there called Pinstreet. You can define an area. You can do a survey where they can use the app to pin somewhere in the area where they would suggest improvements, suggest what the improvement should be, and even upload a photo with it. And we had a lot of participation in that, a lot of inputs. As you can see on the heat map on the lower right side, a lot of the spots where we got insights into the local conditions there. And above all, we did this PSPL study in this area, where you can see on the right side spaces where we did movement counts, how many people are moving here, what time of day. So we do that on a weekday and then on a weekend. We do it throughout the whole day, so we did together a lot of volunteers. You can see the guy with the orange backpack, he's counting. And then in select spots that we define, we do so-called stationary counts, where we register either on paper or using the app that we've developed. We register activities that people are doing. What are they up to? How are they using the spaces? How long are they using it? Are they alone? And so on. And based on this, we can pull out some main conclusions based on all these observations that were made there. Many thousands that were done over these period of time. So then we're able to, from this mapping, to pull out some central points that we want to go in and focus more on. We can see it's a pedestrian area. We see a lot of movement on foot and biking, and actually that's the dominant way of moving in the area. We can see the live area, and then, like I mentioned before, we have this focus on, in several projects recently, on child-friendly communities, so we're driving development areas, and we can see not enough facilities for the children and the elderly. And the elderly in this case is interesting for their own sake, but also because the elderly in this low community are often linked with child-rearing, so they are part of taking care of the kids. And you can see some of the other key points that we got out of this mapping of the survey. Then we can go in and do this storytelling and explain how data is being used. What do we mean with this data and what do we get out of it? So we're not just sharing numbers for the sake of numbers, but we use the data to explain and document what is this we see in the areas. So we've got certain data points and focuses around the pedestrian area. We have certain focus area around bicycle and e-bikes, green mode transportation. We have numbers on how many the local modal split, how many e-bikes, but also we link this with images of what we see. We have a lot of focus on the rhythm of day throughout, the rhythm of the life throughout the day, throughout the weekends, differences between weekend and weekdays. And then we have a lot of focus on facilities and the community experience at a child level for kids, which you can also see on some of these images. For each of them, we have data counts, so from the mapping, from the surveying that we're doing, and then we can also use this Pinstreet tool that I mentioned before to add specific focus areas where we see challenges, and then also quotes from things. We can make focuses like, for example, saying there's really a lack of public seating benches. You can even see from the images we found people who brought their own seating into the public space, really wanted to enjoy it, but couldn't sit anywhere. And then there's the informal seating along one of the main roads in this Jimpa Road community area. And again, we can look at also its stickiness. Do people stay? Do they stay in for a long period of time? And for each of these focus areas that we define in the survey, and through this mapping, we can link this with storytelling and explaining what it is we get out of these numbers. With quotes, keeping it human, keeping it linked to the actual people who live there. from this, now I'm just explaining how we go through this motion of saying how do we do a mapping and turn this into, in this case, an urban strategy. We built this into pilot concepts. There was a key focus for the city of Shanghai to take the mapping and sort of come up with pilots that we test out. Two main focus areas, one that we chose to call Inhabit the Green. So essentially suggestion and strategy around using the green areas, so not ruining, not taking away green areas and building on top of them only, but to work with the green areas and using them as a community space, something you can use when you are having public activities in the community area. The other one is we chose to call it Inhabit Streets in the city spaces. And this is back to this overall notion that's saying that here's a really nice area. There's actually a lot of really good activities. There's a lot of life here. There's a lot of community activity. So the main public space is in this area, like many other areas in Shanghai, probably like many areas in a city like Mexico City and other places around the world. A lot of the public spaces are essentially streets. So the streets, they make up a big part of the public spaces in cities. We tend to use them for car traffic, we tend to use them for traffic. But what are the possibilities of using streets for other things? Not necessarily having to close them down for no traffic, but how can we use them for other community activities than just mobility and especially cars? So we looked at these two, so we came up with the design. I'll run through them a little bit quickly and not go into much details. This is more to explain our process, how we move from a mapping exercise, surveying, understanding, doing analysis, and coming into concepts and urban strategy. For Inhabit Green, we chose location on the Xinhua Road, and we made it close to a kindergarten. So we could also offer a place to play, and we could also provide a place for grandparents to wait, or parents or grandparents, but often it would be a case that grandparents picked up their kids. So a place for them to sit and enjoy and have a bench function in a nice, comfortable area while waiting close to this kindergarten. So we looked a little bit at first where could we find this location. As you can see in the image down there in the bottom left, there's actually an image from one of the participants in this mapping exercise. They sort of took this and shared it by Pin Street. And what it shows is all the people waiting in Shanghai. You have to wait outside the kindergarten when you pick up the kids, so all these parents and grandparents who are waiting to pick up their child, and there's no place to sit if you come very early, there's no place to dwell with it when you come out with your child after kindergarten. So this became sort of a focus area. Can we do something here to improve this? It's a very basic need. The other thing we want to do is when we do an intervention, especially when we do it into the green areas, can we look at improving so-called sponge city concept? So basically, local biodiversity and the ability to absorb water if you get these very heavy rains that you get in Shanghai in the summer. So overall, this is sort of the focus area. We then developed this very simple solution. So that, of course, has quite complex elements to it, especially the biodynamic side. And this became an overall idea that we call then Inhabit the Green. And the idea was you could do it a modular, quite straightforward. So it could be used in different ways throughout this community. And you could make it longer or shorter depending on what kind of needs you want to respond to first. And we made a simple suggestion to how this could go in. You can see there's not a lot of space to work with, but could you actually improve the local community experience, the lived experience in the community, if you were able to go in and place a simple solution like this. So not taking away the green, simply inhabiting it. And then there was some talk about materials, ways of doing this, and this became sort of like I'm just going to go through it very quickly again so you sort of see the flow. There is a focus on saying we have a mapping of the lived experience. We have a focus area, something we wanted to focus on and improve, very specifically around this kindergarten. It's a very neighborhood level, and that's the challenge, that's the opportunity we get when we work at a community neighborhood level. And then you can come in and look at concrete solutions, ways to build it, make it feasible, ways of implementing it that the city and the local community could work with, so the city, the district government as well, and then inspiration for how this would work. So that was one case. The other case we called inhabited the streets and city spaces, and that's responding to the other opportunity we saw here. City is very much focused on open streets, so that's the open public space of the world, but it's a very dense part of Shanghai, a historical part of Shanghai, so there's not a lot of space to go and take from. And we identified these two main areas for pilot projects. One was called Anki Road, and one is Fang Road, that sort of have different opportunities. So nice streets already today, but can we somehow do something to respond to the mapping and to the surveying we've seen in this public life study here? So overall, we made some simple suggestions for what this could be about. On the left-hand side, we have the road as it is today. It's essentially a street, it's not a very big road, but it's filled mostly with space for car traffic. You could ride the bike, of course, on the streets. There's some data elements to that, but that's a possibility. But nothing else. And so people walking past here don't have great spaces to use, but also people living here have no room to play. There's no, the historical district, there's no places we can just find. And then of course people living by also didn't really have too much quality at the street level. So we came up with these suggestions. There's nothing groundbreaking. This has been used, done elsewhere. Actually, the lower image over here is the reference for something we worked on in Mountain View in the US for like street culture. So this is done quite often, and it's definitely an interesting possibility. And we wanted to look at different ways this could be done. Again, constantly referring back to the mapping that we did for this area, the numbers that we got together, the reflectionary activities, the lack of opportunities, and then using, again, on the left-hand side, the input we got from the Pin Street app. In case studies from Copenhagen, referencing things we knew from here, and then coming in with small design solutions for what could be done in a place like Fang Road. How could we maybe make a little bike parking bench system that could offer some new spaces in the city. So this is one way of showing how we get something out at a neighborhood level. In the case of Shanghai here, they're using a mapping that we focus very much on the lived experience of cities. Now I'm just going to hop back to the presentation to show one last example before I end my time with the presentation. So we do this, like I just said, in Shanghai. This is an example from Shanghai. We do it in many other places around the world as well. One area I just want to show is an example also when we have mapping available that is not only made by us. So in this case, we work with a big mapping done in Copenhagen of what's called Google Air View data. So essentially Google Air View data is data collected by the Google Street View cars. They drive around, they map the city of Copenhagen, they take images, but at the same time they do a air quality mapping. So you can sort of get this data that was made available to the city of Copenhagen in this partnership for the full city of Copenhagen. Where was the air quality in what way? And what we did was we used, we teamed up with the city of Copenhagen, something called Copenhagen Solutions Lab, Google, Utrecht University, and we looked to see how can we take this data when we make a neighborhood level implementation and understanding of it. So we coupled this data with this experience data that we collected with the beforehand mentioned field lens. And what we did was we zoomed on in a very specific problem here. So not just to say we look at all air quality problems, but in this case we look specifically at saying, there's a community area we want to test that. We've done different tests throughout Copenhagen. And there's a community group we want to look at. In this case we looked at small children. And one of the reasons we did that was that small children, they breathe faster than adults, and they're still developing central organs, brains and so on. So you can see the example here, the fact here, 90% of a child's brain develops before they're 5 years old. So this is a very challenging, it's a challenge group, or it's a vulnerable group in a city when you look at air quality. So sort of zoom in and define the community we want to look at. That's the kind of lived experience data and the community levels that we wanted to implement. And then we did other ways of trying to understand the lived experience of a child. So we do mapping, we do surveys, we ask people, we do the public life mapping of a neighborhood. But we also experiment to another thing. One of the things is, how do you take the perspective of a young urban citizen when you do something like this? So we had an attempt, I'm going to show on the video now. So basically my colleague Kim on the left side, and it's her son. He has the helmet on with a GoPro. We're going to take a little walk through Copenhagen together with him. Especially this scooter coming up right here suddenly becomes quite dangerous and big. So these are some of the things we can use in our mapping, and also in the storytelling of the mapping, to sort of say, what do we do with this and how do we move forward? So what I'm going to do now, up to the next screen, I'm going to show you very quickly in the last 3-5 minutes before I start talking. Here's a project over a period of time that we did with different collaborators to develop this concept of dry zones, to work in the community with solutions for air quality. And all this was essentially done around a mapping exercise. How do we map something to begin with? How do we test solutions? This pilot project I'll show now. How do we measure more, map more, so we can refine these solutions and take action and improve strategies to make the city more healthy and more child-friendly. So what we did in this project specifically, we did data collection around neighborhoods we were looking at with social media data, Maptionnaire questionnaire. Maptionnaire is like a surveying tool where you map out who moved through the city and used the city, and observations that was done using our methodologies, etc. We looked at 2 neighborhoods specifically that had these challenges, 2 quite different neighborhoods in Copenhagen, and we did pilot interventions. But in one of them, we had a solution that was very much also about the dialogue and communication around an area that looks quite nice, green and lush, but actually had really bad air quality due to some major roads that were leading through it. And we made it also as a meeting room for local residents also to take part of this dialogue around air quality. So we had support issues like this. Then we built this quite interesting dome, almost to sort of symbolize how the experience would be inside a dome with potentially different air quality with plants. And then for each of them we had air quality measurements to test it out. We also did continuous questionnaire surveying, working with local citizens to understand their perception of change, and to see how we used it. We had another intervention. There was a bus stop, really dead bus stop with no great qualities and such, and also right next to the big road. And we essentially, as a pilot, did a better bus stop that also has this air quality focus about encapsulating its space to see what kind of change this could provide. And we had observations there. We did mapping of people's use of it, how long did they use it, what did they like of it, what did they like. So collecting a continuous amount of data on this, and also doing high quality, air quality data collection to see changes. The last pilot intervention more focused on play and for kids, because it's very close to care institutions. We essentially said, can you do something that creates this quite nice green space right as a big road to make it more nice for kids to use in an interesting way. And we came up with these pilot projects that is essentially, the main thing is a green wall that protects towards the street, which experts and scientists helped us design, so we knew that would protect as much against air quality challenges, but also just create a nice space for kids to come and hang out and to use. And this was sort of one of the things that we then tried out. We did a lot of data collection on this. I'm going to end on this image, but the point of this discussion here has sort of been to say mapping, in this case of the public life, the lived experience at a local community level is what we do with GEO. So we constantly work with this way of doing mapping and then focusing on some specific community level. It becomes a big challenge. And I have examples here of child-friendly communities as a focus areas. Many others could be interesting, but this is essentially what I really wanted to do today, and hopefully I can spark some interest and Q&A and discussion about how to use mapping and how to go from mapping, so measuring as we call it, to urban strategy, testing on intervention, trying to do pilots, and then we like the continuous cycle of it, keep going and keep refining the solutions. I'm going to stop here, and I think if my clock is right, I hit exactly 35 minutes, and I'm hoping that was good for the organizers.
Hi Rasmus, can you hear us?
I can hear you now, yes.
Great, thank you very much. Muchas gracias por esta maravillosa presentación. Tenemos el espacio para un par de preguntas. Por ahí algunos de nuestros colegas están pasando con un pedazo de papel por si alguien tuviera alguna pregunta, pero a mí me gustaría hacerte una pregunta inicial, y lo primero es, con la experiencia que tiene la oficina de Eyal trabajando en distintas geografías, en países tan diversos como lo pueden ser el sur global o países nórdicos, cuando en el centro del diseño está el observar y el mapear el comportamiento de las personas y cómo la vida pública de alguna manera se apropia de estos espacios, ¿cuáles han sido las diferencias que han encontrado entre estas distintas geografías en el uso y apropiación del espacio? Y esto se manifiesta a través de las herramientas que utilizan para mapear, o han adaptado algunas de las metodologías para poderlas hacer más locales.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I think overall the methodology, so the approach to studying public life and understand the lived experience, we refine it, of course, we constantly work with it, but I wouldn't say we changed the methodology. Before the studio time, Jan Gehl and colleagues worked a lot in this field, Professor Jan Gehl. Since the studio time, we worked with it to implement it in many different areas. So we use studying public life that we've also described. We have books available How to Study Public Life, for example, is a good book. And so these methodologies are also used by many, they're open source, they're used by many others. But what we do see is that the outcome and what we learn about the lived experience and the use of public space is of course very dependent on the built environment we're in, the climate we're in. There's some interesting things to this discussion. So first of all, there are certain things that we humans share. In a sense, we are similar animals, if you like, Homo sapiens. We have certain characteristics that are sort of qualities. We tend to move at the same speed. All humans seem to move around these 5 kilometers an hour when we walk. And we like walking, so our senses, the way we understand the city, are similar. We often talk about the difference between 5 kilometer an hour architecture and 60 kilometer an hour architecture. It's the difference between if you're experiencing a city by foot or by driving. So some of these lessons are similar everywhere. We also use the public space. In our behavior in public space, we like to have comfort. So there's a basic security and comfort. So this is one of the places where it's different from where we are in the city. Comfort in a public space can be very different, for example, in Mexico City or in Copenhagen. So in Copenhagen, we at one point advised the city to improve a public area, to make the public spaces better. And one of the comfort qualities that we improved was people's ability to spend time in the sun. So Copenhagen is a nice place. It's not very warm, but we have nice sun. When we have it, people want to be in the sun. So to design the public space to react on the mappings we have here, we try to maximize the possibility for people to stay out of the shade and be in the sun, as one example. If you did a similar urban intervention in Mexico City, you might want to improve the possibilities of seeking shade that would improve your comfort. So what I mean with this very simple example is to say the way we study public life, the way we map it can be similar, but the strategies that come out of it need to be very dependent on the context, the climate, and the local neighborhood conditions of the place we're studying. So the results that we see shouldn't be the same in Mexico City and Copenhagen and Shanghai, but the ways that we study the lived experience in cities can be very similar and use the methodology that we always use, and that's also how we do it. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you very much. Y bueno, a mí me quedó la curiosidad, tal vez lo mencionaste en la presentación, pero ya digamos, ya es el segundo día, ya es la segunda ponencia del segundo día y mostraste algunas herramientas que hoy son cada vez más democráticas, más utilizadas, como las aplicaciones. La aplicación que ustedes desarrollaron es un software libre, o sea, cualquiera de nuestros estudiantes aquí en la Facultad de Arquitectura de la UNAM podría descargar la aplicación y utilizarla para analizar la vida pública y mapear las actividades que ven en el espacio público.
The methodology, so the GEO methodology where we study is open source and available for people to use. The systems that we developed, so for example the app that we've developed is being used as a product tool that we have. It takes quite a lot of setting up, so we need to do setting up surveys, platform, data platforms. But if somebody has an interest in it, they're more than welcome to reach out to GEO, and we can definitely work on ways to use this app and this platform. But the software tool is for us to be sort of implementing with partners. But we can definitely use the methodology. That's something that is available for everybody to use.
Rasmus, muchas gracias por habernos compartido distintos ejemplos de lo que se ha mapeado en diversas geografías. Bueno, a mí uno de los hallazgos de todo lo que mostraste que me fascinó, porque creo que puede tener algunas analogías en el caso mexicano, es cuando estudiaron el tema, todo lo que han estado ustedes mapeando y creando las relaciones entre la salud pública y la forma de nuestras ciudades, los hábitos y consumos y cómo hacer ciudades saludables. Y algo que pensé que tal vez en México pueda aplicar es cómo los jóvenes pasan mucho tiempo en las paradas del transporte público. Eso es algo que sucede también en México, donde dependiendo de la zona donde te transportas, a veces tienes que transbordar varias veces. Y a lo mejor aquí no hay McDonald's como en Londres, pero aquí tenemos pues puestitos de tacos, tamales, pan dulce, atole y mucha comida que a lo mejor es hipercalórica y que puede ser una de las causas que contribuya entre la distribución geoespacial de nuestras ciudades, de los bienes, servicios, la vivienda, las largas horas que pasamos en traslados. Pero bueno, eso solo es un comentario y queremos hacerte una pregunta. Al terminar nuestras ponencias tenemos una mesa redonda de debate y preguntarte si quieres participar por Zoom. Sería un Zoom abierto. Llevamos unos 30 minutos de retraso, entonces si te es imposible por la agenda no te preocupes, te mandaremos algunas de las preguntas que surjan para que sepas de este lado las personas en México, muchos alumnos, alumnas, estudiantes de arquitectura, pero también profesionistas de distintas disciplinas tienen sobre el trabajo que hacen en Eyal Architects. Y pues muchísimas gracias de antemano.
So first of all, I want to say that I'm very happy to hear you don't have as many McDonald's as you might have in London, but I'm also very sad to be on a Zoom link right now, because if I had been in Mexico with you, I could have been enjoying some of the nice food you do actually have, so that would have been great. Unfortunately, I have to be up a little bit late here, and I have some family conditions that makes it difficult for me to join the debate later on with the time difference, quite late here. But I have been really enjoying the ability to be here and talk to you today. And if there's any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I'll do my best to stay in this dialogue with you, and I hope that's okay for you all.
Perfecto, pues muchas gracias. Le damos un aplauso.
Gathering, and I hope you get many interesting exchanges and point of views. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this.
Muchas gracias. Y bueno, ahora regresamos a la modalidad presencial. Y tengo el honor de presentar al siguiente ponente, que es el doctor Peter Krieger. Seguramente muchos de ustedes lo conocen. Él es doctor en Historia del Arte por la Universidad de Hamburgo en Alemania. Es investigador en el Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas y profesor en los posgrados en Arquitectura y en Historia del Arte en la UNAM. De 2004 a 2012 fue vicepresidente del Comité Internacional de Historia del Arte. De 2010 a 2018 fue miembro de la Comisión de Publicidad Exterior de la Secretaría de Desarrollo Urbano y Vivienda del Gobierno de la Ciudad de México. Entre el 2016 y el 2017 fue profesor visitante en las universidades de Hamburgo con la cátedra Abi Warburg, Tübingen y Regensburg. Algunas de sus investigaciones y publicaciones, que se han traducido al español, al inglés, al alemán, al francés y al chino, hablan sobre la estética, historia, teoría y iconografía política de ciudades y paisajes, por un enfoque en la geoestética basado en la herencia conceptual de Alexander von Humboldt. Un fuerte aplauso, por favor, para el doctor Krieger.
Muy buenos días a todos ustedes. Primero, quiero dar las gracias a los organizadores por convocarnos en este coloquio muy interesante. Y también quiero hacer un anuncio técnico. Nos sugirieron cortar la ponencia para tener más espacio para el debate, lo que me parece muy bien, porque la retroalimentación sí es algo muy importante. Entonces corté la mitad y presentación, pero con gusto si en el caso si hay una publicación extiendo digamos, mis reflexiones en torno a la cartografía. Y voy a hablar de cartografías e imaginaciones en la crisis ambiental en la megaciudad de México. Entonces, yo represento aquí en este coloquio la historia del arte, las investigaciones estéticas, en especial la llamada ciencia de la imagen. Y entonces, las investigaciones estéticas sobre la cartografía. La cartografía es una construcción visual, y aquí en la pantalla expongo como varios modos de la cartografía de ciudad y paisaje, como la imagen satelital, la infografía, la cartografía abstracta, la cartografía tradicional, e incluso, y de eso voy a hablar al final de esta presentación, la obra de arte. Entonces nos enfrentamos a una gran diversidad de la representación de ciudad y paisaje. Y la cartografía es información, es una construcción visual que proporciona información, pero también manipulación y ejerce control. Digamos, la cartografía es un instrumento de control de territorios. Y de eso voy a hablar hoy también. La cartografía es un instrumento de crítica ambiental. Entonces, aquí el término en alemán Bildwissenschaft, difícilmente traducible, ciencia de la imagen, en español, también en inglés, ciencia está monopolizada por las ciencias, en alemán es diferente, es decir, es una extensión de la historia del arte y abarca todo tipo de imágenes, es decir, analizamos la construcción, la difusión y la recepción de imágenes en diferentes esferas, diferentes discursos, por ejemplo, discursos sobre la cartografía. Y conviene aclarar que investigaciones estéticas no son investigaciones cosméticas, tampoco defino la estética como, digamos, como la definición normativa de lo bello, sino en el sentido aristotélico como cognición sensorial. Es decir, es lo que ilustro aquí con esta gráfica del siglo XVII de René Descartes, una cosa simplificada que ahora es realmente más complejo, es decir, el acto de ver genera conexiones neuronales diferentes a otras operaciones neuronales, como por ejemplo el análisis matemático e informático de un paisaje. Entonces la imagen es como una entidad que cataliza el conocimiento y es cognición sensorial. Y especialmente aquí nuestro tema, la imagen del espacio, la imagen del territorio, digamos, ofrece, digamos, un sinnúmero de conocimientos, y pongo aquí en medio la imagen de Alexander von Humboldt, quien hace 200 años propuso un concepto que es más actual que nunca, que relaciona la investigación científica sobre el paisaje con la medición de la presión del aire, investigaciones geológicas, con una indagación estética del paisaje y, digamos, su herencia ha dejado como muchas huellas en el discurso visual en las Américas en el siglo XIX, especialmente en la pintura de paisaje. Y Humboldt también era un innovador de los modos cartográficos. Por ejemplo, aquí demuestro la geografía de las plantas como, digamos, un modo diferente de conceptualizar, visualizar los elementos botánicos y geológicos del paisaje. Y un instrumento de investigación, de mi investigación, es, digamos, una línea, es la iconografía política. Ya dije, la cartografía es un instrumento de control. Entonces, aquí vemos al lado izquierdo la Biblioteca de Ciencias Culturales de Aargau, en Hamburgo, donde se encuentra un índice de iconografía política, todavía en formato análogo, en papel, como en el proceso de digitalizarlo, etcétera, que tiene como 150.000 imágenes ordenados por temas, por ejemplo, el tema paisaje, catástrofes, también la cartografía como un instrumento político. Es decir, digamos, la cartografía que ejerce un control del espacio, tiene una larga iconografía, tiene construcciones visuales, esquemas visuales con los cuales se representa el paisaje y la ciudad. Y en lo siguiente voy a presentar algunos ejemplos, unos pocos ejemplos de esta diversidad en torno a la cartografía urbana y ambiental. Entonces inicio con un proyecto de un urbanista alemán, Klaus Humpert, que justamente hace 20 años publicó su libro sobre los principios fundamentales del crecimiento urbano, inspirado por la teoría de los fractales. Y él hizo, digamos, con su equipo, esas mapas negras con esa escala que está aquí indicada. Se basó en el análisis de imágenes satelitales y luego simplificó, digamos, esta información en espacios construidos en negro y en espacios abiertos en blanco. Vemos aquí al lado izquierdo la mancha urbana de Ciudad de México. Entonces, lo que es interesante en su investigación, lo que uno de sus resultados, es que las ciudades, las megaciudades del sur global son más compactas que las grandes ciudades del norte global, como Chicago, Londres, etc. Entonces, vemos aquí una contradicción entre, digamos, la mancha urbana, como vemos en la cartografía al lado derecho, con los límites de Ciudad de México, más la zona conurbada, etcétera, que nos parece como una mancha enorme, pero, digamos, esta cartografía revela otros principios, un alto grado de densidad y cierta fragmentación, digamos, en las orillas. Y entonces, para digamos, hacerlo más obvio, todos tenemos como imágenes mentales de la ciudad. Por ejemplo, los ponentes que llegan aquí a este coloquio llegan con el avión y ven una mancha enorme. Entonces piensan que esa ciudad es infinita, y las vistas, digamos, aéreas como esta comprueban eso. Pero, digamos, en comparación con esta cartografía abstracta, vemos como otros principios inherentes a la megaciudad de México. Entonces estamos aquí en digamos, un tipo de contradicción entre las diferentes visualizaciones de la ciudad, de la megaciudad, del paisaje, y nuestras imaginaciones. Y estamos permanentemente en esta contradicción. Por ejemplo, eso también menciona Klaus Humpert en su libro. Cuando hablamos de Nueva York pensamos en Manhattan, pero Manhattan nada más es un 2% de la ciudad de Nueva York. Entonces combina, digamos, se refiere a nuestra idea, a nuestra imagen mental de la ciudad medieval, de la ciudad amurallada, en este caso de Manhattan, la ciudad entre los ríos, que tiene límites, mientras gran parte de Nueva York no tiene límites. Entonces, en la revisión de esta diversidad de cartografías, vemos justamente el motor cognitivo, que es la comparación. Otra cartografía es la cartografía artística. Entonces, ven, aquí estoy como expandiendo el campo, digamos, temático de la cartografía, y muestro aquí una obra de la artista británica Melanie Smith. Ella vivió mucho tiempo en Ciudad de México. Entonces, hace 20 años hizo el proyecto Spiral City, rentó un helicóptero y fue como en espirales, en caminos espirales sobre Ciudad de México, sobre esta mancha enorme, digamos, de Ciudad de México, y luego produjo videos, fotografías, también pinturas, pero, digamos, esta imagen, digamos, es una obra de arte, no solamente una obra de arte, sino también es una imagen política, porque nos muestra cómo se organiza, digamos, una sociedad urbana con estas supercuadras, por ejemplo, aplicando un esquema antiguo de control del espacio. Entonces, la obra de arte también es parte de la cartografía. Y tenemos la cartografía tradicional. Aquí expongo un ejemplo del atlas de riesgos que, digamos, publica el gobierno de la Ciudad de México, donde vemos también una cierta simplificación, digamos, los suelos de conservación en verde, es muy obvio, zona verde, conservación, y el resto en tonos ocre y gris, que demuestra que el sur de la ciudad, según esta cartografía, digamos, es como el último refugio de la naturaleza en esta cuenca de México, que está ocupada por, digamos, una mega ciudad de más de 20 millones de habitantes. Sin embargo, si comparamos este atlas de riesgos con otras, digamos, trabajos cartográficos como esto, donde, digamos, utilizaron una imagen satelital y, digamos, procedieron y entonces pusieron en verde también las zonas naturales y resulta otra imagen. Entonces el fondo otra vez es la imagen, digamos, de las superficies cubiertas con urbanización, pero, digamos, en esa perspectiva o en este modo cartográfico vemos un anillo verde alrededor de la mega ciudad, alrededor, digamos, de ese centro muy denso, de esta mancha que vimos en la fotografía anterior. Y entonces es información muy interesante y además es punto de partida para repensar la ciudad y la naturaleza, que para mí es el gran tema de la actualidad, del futuro, del próximo. Y, digamos, aquí otra imagen satelital que demuestra cómo esta cuenca, esta, digamos, configuración geológica se encuentra, digamos, en un proceso de erosión y de destrucción por la hiperurbanización. Es decir, aquí la cartografía por medio de la imagen satelital es una detección de, digamos, esos procesos de destrucción, más que de autodestrucción, lo que hacemos nosotros como seres humanos, como habitantes de la República de México, con digamos, este lugar único de bio y geodiversidad. Y aquí otro tipo de cartografía más con tintes un poco naif, pero con información muy valiosa, que demuestra, digamos, el sistema de lagos de la ciudad Tenochtitlán, de toda la cuenca, digamos, que era un ecosistema muy especial, casi completamente perdido a lo largo de los últimos 6-7 décadas. Entonces, esas son como cartografías históricas que demuestran, en este caso, el cambio drástico de la ciudad lacustre al desierto megalopolitano. Y aquí otro modo de la cartografía, que es, encontré eso de casualidad en un programa de flight tracking, es decir, digamos, vemos cómo, digamos, nuestro globo, digamos, está cubierto por movimientos aéreos. Y en esta cartografía, en México, aquí Ciudad de México, vemos cómo, digamos, el cielo arriba de la ciudad está cubierto por aviones. Entonces aquí la infografía de la contaminación aérea, no solamente por las emisiones terrestres, sino también por las emisiones aéreas, por el tráfico aéreo. Entonces, esos son algunos ejemplos de la gran diversidad digamos, de las cartografías. Y digamos, el modo dominante son las imágenes satelitales, como esta imagen que es la teledetección de campos electromagnéticos, que es una información básica para el extractivismo, y vemos aquí la alteración de colores para, digamos, conseguir la información para el extractivismo, es decir, digamos, la reducción del paisaje ciudad a una información económica, a un recurso económico. Y este mapa, digamos, esta imagen satelital, luego fue el punto de partida para una obra de arte que pueden ver aquí al lado en el Museo de Artes y Ciencia. Es la instalación Stratum, una intervención geoestética de Luis Carrera Maol, que justamente el artista se basó en esta imagen satelital y hizo, digamos, una simulación de la cuenca de México basado en este mapa con, digamos, la silueta de las montañas para, digamos, explicar explicar, digamos, en su modo artístico varios temas de la crisis del antropoceno que estamos viendo, como por ejemplo que la tecnomasa actualmente pesa más que la biomasa de la Tierra, es decir, tecnomasa de ciudades, infraestructuras, también basura, también micrófonos, etcétera, pesa más que la biomasa. Y entonces es algo que domina, digamos, es una problemática dominante en la cuenca de México, donde, repito, digamos, tuvimos un alto grado de bio y geodiversidad, pero la realidad es como una bastante presencia de la tecnomasa, de la basura, procesos de erosión y también procesos de desertificación y contemporaneidades conflictivas que en un proceso de hiperurbanización de unos 6-7 décadas, digamos, se pierde, digamos, la herencia geológica, geomorfológica de millones de años. Esos son temas como de la exposición Stratum que ven aquí al lado, están obviamente invitados a la pausa del café o cuando... Entonces, es una obra de arte que se basa en una cartografía y con ello, digamos, se convierte digamos, hace una transición del mapa a la imagen satelital, a la instalación, a la intervención, y es una cartografía artística transitable. Entonces yo puedo recorrer esta cartografía y tener como otras impresiones, otros acercamientos, otras conexiones neuronales de la cartografía tradicional. Y surgen aquí esas coincidencias muy interesantes entre micro y macro, explicables, claro, con la teoría de los fractales, donde vemos aquí otra vez digamos, la imagen satelital, y luego un detalle, digamos, en esas superficies que están cubiertas con una masa de cerámica. Entonces la instalación se hizo con desechos de cerámica. Hay una parte verde que regamos, y entonces esa parte verde luego pintó los suelos, digamos, de esta manera, de manera autopoética, es una autopoesis estética que revela, digamos, en la microvista, digamos, también principios del desarrollo urbano. O, digamos, estas manchas al lado izquierdo, una vista satelital nocturna de Ciudad de México, y otra vez un detalle, digamos, que surgió a lo largo de las semanas en los suelos que hizo el artista. Entonces son las huellas de metamorfosis que estamos viendo a micro macro que generan como cartografías alternativas. Entonces surgen temas, como ya lo mencioné, de la erosión de valores geomorfológicos, de la constitución geomorfológica de la cuenca de México. Vemos procesos de iteración en la instalación. Entonces expongo eso aquí como un modo de alternativa. Tuvimos aquí en las presentaciones anteriores accesos prácticos, digamos, a la cartografía de datos, etcétera, pero quiero subrayar también, digamos, la cartografía estética como un acceso alternativo a la comprensión compleja de las ciudades, y también como contribución a las cartografías, es decir, escribir cartografía críticas en torno a la apropiación, digamos, de nuestros entornos, y también a generar un conocimiento de orientación en tiempos que estamos viviendo el antropoceno, digamos. El antropoceno es una categoría todavía no oficial, pero, digamos, vigente en los debates que, digamos, propuso el científico Paul Crutzen en esa famosa, digamos, el famoso artículo en la revista Nature en 2002, como vemos aquí ilustrado con algo más o menos naif. Entonces aquí está mi punto de partida de investigación, de ver cómo esos contenidos del antropoceno, los debates científicos, requieren el complemento, digamos, de estudios visuales, por ejemplo, en torno a la imagen satelital como representación de valores inherentes al paisaje, o de la imaginación artística, y todo ello como forma de cognición sensorial. Tenemos que exponernos a algo inesperado y activar diferentes conexiones neuronales para tener una cartografía compleja y crítica de nuestras ciudades y nuestros paisajes en el antropoceno. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Krieger. Por favor, vayan escribiendo las preguntas, anoten hasta abajo a quién van dirigidas. Mientras tanto, yo hago una pregunta al doctor Krieger. Creo que vamos casi a la mitad del coloquio y hemos visto ya un amplio espectro de distintas aproximaciones a la cartografía, al mapeo. Y algo que me llamó la atención de su presentación, doctor, es la taxonomía temática que nos ofrece, ¿no? Una probadita de la taxonomía temática de los mapas y la introducción de la idea de la ciencia de la construcción de la imagen. En ese sentido, me quedo pensando y me gustaría saber su punto de vista sobre la manera en la que evaluamos algo como cartografía o consideramos una imagen como cartografía dependiendo del producto que es y dependiendo del proceso de cómo se construye la imagen. Ayer en la presentación de Ximena Ocampo, ella ponía sobre la mesa la distinción entre el mapping y el mapmaking, entre el mapeo y el hacer el mapa. ¿Cómo piensa usted que el proceso que hemos visto, los procesos que hemos visto aquí generarían más que una temática, una taxonomía temática, una taxonomía procesual? Es decir, vimos muchos ejemplos de artistas o de individuos o de fotografías incluso producidas casi de manera automática a partir de las máquinas. ¿Qué hay de las cartografías? ¿Qué hay de la parte del proceso social de la producción de una cartografía?
Sí, primero tengo que reconocer que no estuve ayer porque era mi clase, entonces no puedo responder a eso, pero claro, digamos, lo que hacemos nosotros, digamos, en esos estudios visuales, la ciencia de la imagen, es como repetir en pasos lentos y analíticos lo que está pasando en el cerebro cuando veo una imagen. Pues aquí en ese coloquio, digamos, que vi hoy en la mañana, y lo que vamos a ver, digamos, sí, tenemos un discurso visual y en muchos casos son imágenes fungen como instrumentos de manipulación. Entonces hay muchos cambios de datos, entonces ahí, digamos, intervenimos nosotros y hacemos más lento, digamos, el proceso y vemos cómo, digamos, se construye una imagen, cuáles son los esquemas visuales. También en muchos casos cuando son las tradiciones, las creencias de un motivo. Es muy interesante en la cartografía, digamos, hay muchos cambios que tienen que ver con nociones coloniales, conquistas territoriales, etcétera, dónde está el centro del mundo, etcétera. Todo implícitamente, muchas de esas nociones aparecen también en los discursos actuales, aparecen como muy atractivos, con simulaciones gráficas en la computadora, pero el fondo, el principio es parecido, y ahí, digamos, frenamos un poco este esquema de impulso y reacción, y vemos, abrimos lo que Avi Warburg llamó Denkraum, espacio de reflexión, porque estamos viviendo una cultura visual que nos aplasta. Se habla como de la inundación de imágenes, y muy pocos tienen como las capacidades neuronales o intelectuales para procesar esas imágenes. Y claro, también arquitectos urbanistas tienden a jugar con eso para convencer a sus clientes y sus proyectos que tienen elaboradas estrategias visuales para vender productos, para vender proyectos, etc. Entonces, esa es como nuestra contribución de conocer en qué consiste, digamos, la estrategia visual, la estrategia de convencer algo o de manipular algo, ¿no? Y claro, el tema también es aún más complejo, nada más brevemente lo dije en el caso de la imagen mental que tenemos de Nueva York. Entonces, la percepción en parte también se nutre de la ficción, de lo que vemos, lo que queremos. Entonces, eso es como otro aspecto de diferencias que investigan los neurólogos que tenemos que tomar en cuenta cuando hablamos de cartografías. Y ahí, digamos, vemos en detalle qué colores, qué ángulos, qué centros, qué otras maneras de manipulación de información existen.
Muchas gracias. Otra pregunta. Bueno, tengo aquí una pregunta del público que pide desarrollar de manera breve la teoría de los fractales. Creo que tiene un poquito que ver con la segunda pregunta que quería hacer yo, que tiene que ver con la relación que hay entre cultura y naturaleza en el antropoceno. Porque por un lado hemos trabajado mucho tiempo con una definición de naturaleza que es, por definición, lo que no es humano, y más recientemente empezamos a desarrollar una idea de una naturaleza híbrida donde lo humano y lo natural no se pueden separar. Y en un momento más reciente estamos cayendo en cuenta que eso también es problemático, que hasta cierto punto sí debemos de mantener una separación entre lo natural y lo humano, porque el riesgo es caer en naturalizar procesos políticos, ¿no? Creo que muchas de las imágenes que nos mostró al final, donde vemos por un lado la ciudad como un artefacto híbrido y por otro lado el proceso fractal o de cómo crece el moho, sugiere que hay una relación entre ambos fenómenos. ¿Es problemática esta relación o es productiva esta relación, a su manera de ver?
Bueno, primero, yo creo que en este breve tiempo no puedo dar una lección en la teoría de los fractales, pero digamos, se basa en el matemático Mandelbrot, como hace como 40 años, entonces es una alternativa a la geometría euclidiana, que revela otros principios que no son como según esa lógica tradicional de la geometría. Eso creo que es lo interesante. Y entonces esa teoría, digamos, también se aplicó a la comprensión, como vemos de aquí, de las ciudades. Porque las ciudades como México tienen partes planeadas, pero tienen muchas partes no planeadas. Entonces surgen, digamos, patrones que con los métodos tradicionales del urbanismo no podemos entender. Entonces esas son como las transferencias interesantes. Y también lo que es, digamos, claro, lo dije para mí, en mi investigación, en mis clases, etc., es el gran tema, la redefinición de ciudad-naturaleza. Y es un, claro, mega tema, un poco lo mencioné aquí. Tenemos aquí, como cerca de Ciudad de Italia, un caso extraordinario, que es la reserva ecológica de Pedro de Weizman. Pues ahí está para mí un núcleo, en medio de la mega ciudad, en esa densidad, tenemos una reserva donde dejan crecer la vegetación. Sin embargo, la reserva, digamos, no es la naturaleza, sino la reserva se basa en la voluntad humana. Entonces, cualquier intento de preservar, conservar la naturaleza es al fondo algo absurdo, algo contradictorio, porque la naturaleza está en un proceso permanente autopoético. A la naturaleza no les interesa lo que hacemos nosotros. Por eso también no existen, en sentido estricto, catástrofes naturales. Existen catástrofes que nosotros generamos por ejemplo, la construcción de ciudades en zonas sísmicas, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, ahí está, digamos, una problemática muy fuerte, lo que dijiste, digamos, el entendimiento de la naturaleza como algo opuesto. Estamos viviendo en tiempos en que en el mundo casi no existe naturaleza salvaje, muy poco, cada vez más se reduce. Entonces, lo que vemos también en las imágenes, no sé, en National Geographic, en televisión, etcétera, es naturaleza preparada. Entonces, donde también tenemos como valores de animales que generan emociones, como delfines, y animales malos, como arañas, etcétera. Tenemos como nuestros filtros de cómo ver la naturaleza, pero de fondo es una naturaleza preparada para nosotros, para los seres humanos. Por eso, digamos, yo veo como la propuesta de la REPSA o de otras reservas como algo muy bueno, donde se revaloran, digamos, la vegetación autopoética como algo completamente contrastante a nosotros. Porque, digamos, contrastante a la naturaleza ornamental que tenemos en los proyectos inmobiliarios, el pasto cortado, estamos aquí en Ceú, es muy bonito para caminar, pero el fondo es como una captación del ecosistema, etc. Entonces, eso es una temática muy interesante para mí, cartografiar en varios términos, digamos, también en botánico, cómo, digamos, se expande la naturaleza auténtica del lugar como una contrapuesta de nuestro mundo urbano y sustentable.
Muchas gracias, doctor. Ojalá podamos continuar la plática. Vamos a continuar la mesa redonda. Presentando a nuestro cuarto ponente en el segundo bloque del Coloquio Internacional Cartografías Críticas. Tenemos a Nikos Katsikis. Nikos es urbanista que trabaja en la intersección entre la teoría de la urbanización, el diseño y el análisis geoespacial. Su investigación busca, a través de la experimentación conceptual y cartográfica, contribuir a la comprensión geográfica de las relaciones sociometabólicas entre las aglomeraciones y sus paisajes operativos. Actualmente Nikos es profesor asistente en el Departamento de Urbanismo en Tudela e investigador en el Urban Theory Lab en Chicago y el Future Cities Laboratory en el ETH de Zurich. Anteriormente fue tutor de investigación en el Royal College of Arts de Londres y becario postdoctoral de la Universidad de Luxemburgo. Nikos tiene un doctorado en diseño de la Harvard Graduate School of Design, donde formó parte del consejo editorial de New Geographies, la revista doctoral de la Escuela de Diseño, y fue coeditor de New Geography 6, Grounding Metabolism. En la Escuela de Diseño se ha desempeñado como instructor en planeamiento y diseño de planeación y diseño urbano, y también como investigador y asociado, docente asociado. Nikos tiene un título profesional en arquitectura con distinción. Trabaja, una maestría en Ciencias de la Arquitectura y Diseño Espacial de la Universidad Técnica Nacional de Atenas. Su trabajo reciente incluye contribuciones en Harvard Design Magazine, New Geographies y MONU, capítulos en el libro de Implosiones, haciendo estudio de la organización planetaria junto con Neil Brenner, haciendo investigación urbana global junto con Michael Euler, la metrópolis horizontal junto con Paola Vigano, el volumen editado de Manhattan, Greek for Ordering and Island con Joan Busquets y Positions on Emancipation con Florian Kirkwood. Y un próximo libro con Neil Brenner, Is the World Urban, haciendo una crítica de la ideología geoespacial. Nikos, es un placer y un honor contar contigo. El escenario es todo tuyo. Muchísimas gracias.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the organizers, Ricardo, Laura, Enrique, Tito. So, my presentation today, what I will do is work I have been developing most importantly in collaboration with the designers. And it's about ways to understand the organization of the city, the urban situation. In a way, it picks up some of the issues that Peter mentioned before. So how can we understand, conceptualize, visualize, the emphasis? And we have a particular take on that. Our take is that urbanization is a major process in saving the emphasis. And I know it has been a quite long time already, so I felt like rapidly start with Star Wars and your science history. So normally when someone says planetary urbanization or urbanization is urban, they think of improving cities. Hopefully no one thinks that we are in this kind of situation of the whole planet, translated as one big city or one big cities. But the reason I have this here is that, interestingly, even in science fiction, you need to have some consistency with the worlds. And if you have a planet, that the whole planet is the whole planet is a city, this means that you also need to have a planet that is, an agricultural production planet, a mining planet. So you need to have this source of production, resource extraction, universes to support your city. Now, unfortunately or fortunately, in our case, all these planets are collapsed. Right? We are living in planets that we have to support the cities. We have to animate these environments as planetary organization, and our effort to do this stuff is to understand how almost all the geographies that are operational around the planet have to do with this process of colonization. This is a series of snippets from the video animation, latest and it's somehow trying to do an impressionist of the anthropogenic. I will unpack what this is, but the whole presentation is to understand why this is a more interesting interpretation of colonization than the typical one that we have in the world of cities, these points, dots, in somehow empty terrain. And when we started doing this work, we kind of started working with global spatial data organization to understand how we can use them to visualize planetary organizations that we have to do. And we have actually realized that we have major challenges in what we define as metageographies of the earth. And this idea of metageography because in our work we don't really construct the data sets so much, we don't really do hands-on research to space information. We use cartographic experimentation to feed theoretical implementation, organization of different spatial categories that we want to construct and understand. So it's cartography in the service of theory, but also it should be the other way, using more theory to define categories, ways, visualizing, representing organization. And when we started to investigate how we normally visualize, represent, we realized that there are two ideologies or frameworks or assumptions that we have in the head that somehow define the construction, the process of information and the presentation. And we summarize them using these two symbols, the bounded city, the idea of the spike. And I will make my presentation first. So metageography is something like a meta framework. It's a set of assumptions, ideas that we have about a certain phenomenon that we want to represent. So let's say you want to represent, right? You want to have a map, urbanization. You need to have an understanding about what the urban needs to do, or if it's a shared media, or different ideas. So it's kind of an epistemological question behind the construction of metageographies, but also it has to do with the socio-technical construction of these spaces. So, the bounded city metageography, just in a nutshell, we feel that what is guiding it is this idea that the colonization is a process of population concentration of cities, right? So it has to do with people moving to cities, it's expanding, right? And the second, the spiky wall, the geography, has to do with this interpretation of cities as economic entities. But this is where we're moving, this is where most of the economic activity takes place, and most importantly, this is where value is used. This is also why this type of representation, because the whole idea of this investigation is that by understanding the organization of the cities, understanding the organization of concentration, we are also able to understand the production of socio-ecological values beyond the cities and place cities fulfill this protocol of interdependence. So the typical starting point of this bounded city geography problem, or what you call it, is this idea of the urban space function of this law, right? That we have the total population of the world, globally, and some percentage of it is living in cities, right? And at some point, cities, these populations are 50%, 75% of all these rates count. And as this happens, the cities expand, right? And it's interesting to think that this definition of the urban population doesn't really have to do with population itself. It has to do with the location where these people are. So they are supposed to be engulfed within a very specific area that we call city. And the interesting point is that this definition of what this city is about, and don't worry, you have to is quite contested, meaning different countries, different census, statistical offices define different ways what the urban is. Try to collect a lot of these definitions in this document, and I'm starting to think, oh, unfortunately, it's not really this either. But you will be able to see in this either always that the definitions range from, oh, it has to be the density more than 500 kilometers to the city if it's more than 2,500 inhabitants. I think in Mexico, it was quite interesting to set that together. I think there's a very low threshold on how large the settlement is supposed to be to qualify as a settlement. But the bottom line here is that there is no consensus on what the city is, which means that there is no consensus on what the urban population is. And yet we have been able to extract these diagrams that show the urban or non-urban population. Even more interesting, in all these definitions, so they gave you the same. The urban is defined, the rural is less defined, is the less defined. Basically saying, oh, cities are, if urban is the population of settlement, big land, density of land, and the rural is everything. Everything that lies outside. Now, this is not to say that population distribution doesn't matter, right? But I think it's a bit more productive to think of urbanization as having to do in a much more generic way with the patterns of distribution of human population, which, if you follow this diagram, you can see with darker colors higher densities and the horizontal axis fighting back. Okay, on the horizontal you can see the decades on the 1800. And you can see that, of course, more and more people are living in higher densities. And interestingly, population has been densifying faster than it has been growing, which has led also the diffusion of patterns of concentrated urbanization that used to be quite defined, now they have this post-metropolitan force that are quite tricky to actually delineate. So think of the equation here. You have to define a boundary around the city center. Where is this boundary? The census has a certain definition of where it is. With the move sensing, you have also to define, for example, this, to define an urban area that classifies as urban, and classified as a very simple land gathering, no sense land gathering, will probably tell you that you just follow the density of the cleanup areas, and this qualifies as also understanding where the urban is in this case. The urban is this one, right? So these are the areas that the artificial land gathering is more than 50%. Right? Why 50%? 60%? That's an assumption, right? But again, the important thing here is that there is this idea that the urban is associated with density areas. Right? The second aspect that the urban is associated with is high population density. This is a bit of a more sophisticated way understanding, the boundaries of the urban from the global human layer, and they have constructed this model of combining density of land cover and population densities. And you can see here again, you have certain thresholds that are just assumptions. Right? So you say density of build-up must be more than 50%, and the population is more than 50,000. And 1,060K is an assumption. The important point here is that you use that to delineate. So you want these layers, you delineate this urban, non-urban threshold here. And you even classify. So you say that there are dense urban centers, and then there are the urban clusters somehow around them. Again, point being, we need to throw a boundary around the area. Right? So that might be useful in doing that. It could be useful because you have different problems in land use, you have real estate boundaries, you have all those things. But the point is that if you take, from the land cover perspective, if you take all these different urban areas, and this is again for the global definition, if you take all these areas in the world, they don't really take up that much land. Right? They take up something like 3% of all the land covered. And the use land that we are actually operational is something like 70%. So 3% out of the 70% is the cities, and the rest is not. But obviously, the question is, it's somehow related to like the cities. So can we conceptualize these landscapes as a support system of cities, something like that? This is the question that we have at the urban theory. So understanding a bit better the situation. But actually, if you think about it, this map, it shows you a bit better the extent of human activity on the planet. And I believe I'm tracking what these areas are. But again, it creates this dichotomy between the orange parts and the urban areas and everything else. Right? Is there a way to go beyond that? So step number one is understand urbanization as not something that has to do with population concentration per se, but actually as something that has to do with the patterns of overall geographical urbanization because of this concentration. Right? It's not saying that cities are not important, the concentration of population is not important. It's not like that. It's the same that there is a certain social and spatial division of labor associated with the fact that we have these high densities and these areas of high concentration of population and economic activity. And this is well summarized in this model published a few years ago by Schmidt. And you can say that urbanization as we normally conceptualize it is what here is called concentrated urbanization. So cities with density of activity, density infrastructure, density of states, but this is only one side of the coin. The other being these areas of extended urbanization. So these dark maps on the map that I showed you before, that are these areas of agriculture, resource extraction, circulation, waste disposal that constitute this metabolic base of urbanization. Now the important thing is that this relationship is static. It's not something that it's at some point introduced and constructed and then it's there. Right? It's in a constant process of creating interaction. And I think we are in a quite interesting moment in observing it, because even in areas of the world where you don't have urbanization happening in the traditional sense, meaning population growth, expansion of cities, let's say in Europe, we don't have any of that, right? However, we have a reconstruction of the material basis of urbanization through all these Green Deal ideas, green energy transition that are reconstructing the relationship of these areas of concentrated urbanization to this broad of operational landscapes of extended organization. And I think it's worth contemplating that, because also it helps us go beyond the quite confusing interpretation of the demographic kind of population-centric approach of the dynamics of the population, meaning that at some point, if cities stop growing, urbanization stops. In this case, if we understand urbanization as a process of geographical urbanization, it's not about, if population stops, expanding, or cities stop expanding, urbanization stops, but actually it's understanding how this relationship between these agglomeration zones and their operational landscapes is constantly reactive. Now, just to give you an idea of what lies behind this dark mass, interestingly enough, if you just do very simple overlays of global geospatial data, this is the Cartografías of the world, and you start comparing them with each other, you make some quite observations. One of them is that something that we normally associate with cities, like built-up space, basically built space. Of course, in terms of volume, like density, most of the built-up space in cities. But around 50% of built-up areas are not in cities, or actually they are not even in any sort of settlement. They are in infrastructures, transportation infrastructures, dams, and all those structures that are basically standing this terrain. But of course, most of these landscapes, most of this dark mass, that constitutes the 70% of the used part of the planet, they are softscapes, agricultural zones, grazing zones, forestry zones, and of course, even fisheries that we have to consider that are operational in the oceans and infrastructure networks that tie all those things together. Both ground surface, marine, aviation networks. And sometimes you get an idea about this darkness behind the system of settlements. But even more interestingly, if you actually get rid of this idea of the bounded city, you can start investigating with a much more emphasis on the variegated nature of these landscapes, all these dark mass before were solid before. So this is just impressionistic, usually it's just overlapping, layers is not distracting any new precipitation, but it's just introducing an effort to go beyond these dualism that the city non-city, urban non-urban. Now, unfortunately, we don't have that many concepts, spatial concepts, actually, that will help us spatialize this relationship of these areas of concentrated urbanization and linking all these landscapes. The major concept that we have for understanding is this idea of the city. So you have a city, you have an area of population, and then you have a region around it that somehow has to provide all the raw materials or the resources to the city, which is also manufacturing center. And this is probably best described in this quite old model by the German cultural economist Doung-Grunnet. And in his idea, he has this archetypal model of what he calls the isolated state, which is somehow summarizing this relationship, this functional relationship between the city and its city. Like you have a city, you have only the city, basically, where you have all the trade happening, where you have all the manufacturing, and all the processing of raw materials, and then you have this hinterland area around it, which is organized in different zones of production according to the distance in the center, which are providing to the city all these raw materials that the city needs. And of course, these areas are dependent upon the city for its manufacturing goods and the services. And this is a quite pervasive model, although this is a theoretical model. This is still very pervasive for a lot of us, I think, in how we understand this relationship between the city and its region. Right? You have the city, it's the center for trade, service for manufacturing, you have the supply providing regions all around you. And you can even think of this map as basically Fontunen's city. All these settlements, right? All these dots correspond to the city. And this dark mass, the operational planning, corresponds to Fontunen's isolated state. Of course, this would suggest quite impossible situation in which, this idea of the hinterland that used to be direct, right? You have actually a very different relationship in Fontunen's model. It was regional, right? It was supposed to. You didn't really have this region, and of course, it was diverse, meaning you had all these different commodities produced in this region. It would suggest that this would still apply in the condition of the present day, but as we know, due to globalization also of primary production, the primary sector of the economy, we have much more globalized, much more specialized, and much more indirectly linked landscapes, primary productions. So what do we do? Can we still use this spatial concept? Probably not, but in order to get better grasp why this is not the case, I have here a series of maps showing you the distribution of these different elements of primary production and how we are quite specialized and localized in specific areas around the world. So obviously we have extraction zones, you have to do the geographic distribution of resources, but also the energy resources that we have, and we have seen how problematic this has become. But even in agriculture, we have quite a lot of specialization in the zones of agricultural production. You see how concentrated the production of certain commodities probably better manifested in the production of the farm, where you have more than 80% of global production in this specific region in the world. So, in the same way that we have certain regions of the world, certain cities of the world, specializing in certain sectors of the economy, the globalization of the primary sectors of the economy, agriculture, mining, resource extraction, has been also creating these specialized operational primary production. Of course, these vary, and the way production is organized on the planet is extremely variegated, and it's very, very risky when you have presentation like that. That is so much based on global data to obscure these differences. That's just a very simple way of trying to dig deeper in understanding the cropland zones and how they're different. This map basically overlays to the two major production systems that you could say we have in agriculture. One that you can see dominating the global north, right, in parts of South America, and which is actually producing crops that cannot be consumed directly, right? So they are not really contributing nutritionally to the people living there or in the world. They are mostly used for feed, for feeding animals, or even for fuel, or for agricultural commodities, industrial commodities, cotton. And then you have areas in the world with the blue border that most of the crops cultivated are actually, feeding them rice. And in this indirect configuration of operational landscapes like that, so this is the core belt of the US, for example, it's not really feeding any city, right? It's not the hinterland of any city, it's the hinterland of this kind of landscape. Of cows, it's a confined animal operation. So again, this explodes a bit this idea that we have these regional food systems. And hopefully, through this presentation, you already realize how problematic some approaches to sustainable urban food systems could be, given the fact that with the partnership of related integration that we have at the moment, it's quite hard to imagine the production of food at the local region. And of course, besides plants and people, we often forget that the planet is inhabited by animal species that we heavily operationalize. We have the three main categories of livestock. And you can also see that the population, so 30 to 50 animals are appropriated in here. And you can see the distribution, how they vary, and how they also correspond to cultural regions. But these are all also populations in the world that often remain unnoticed if we keep having this very human population interpretation and domination. Now, where do we go from there? I mean, it's not just a land use, land cover, geographical question. For us, it's more a question of understanding how urbanization is expanded, understanding easily with questions of social and ecological patterns, social and ecological inequality. We feel that it's quite narrow the way that issues of inequality are discussed in relation to the So we either have inequality happening within the city, so social stratification within the city, let's say you define something like a boundary, and then you actually observe what is happening in a given city, or you compare cities with each other, or then you have other discussions of inequality between the city and the non-city. Right? Best exemplified, I think, in the latest electoral results in the UK, in the US, city, non-city, kind of social cultural divide. Right? And we want to go a bit beyond that. And in order to do that, the second obstacle that we had was this idea of the spiking wall. And I don't know, probably none of you are old enough here to remember the influence of this concept that was mostly popularized by Richard Rohr in the creative class and all these discussions celebrating cities and density as the places of innovation, of generating economic output, and activity. So they were basically considered as the economic entities. Right? And it's interesting to see how a map that disaggregates global GDP according to population. So normally, you have a map of global GDP that looks like that. Because GDP is like a national product. But this doesn't really take into understand the patterns of distribution of economic output within the country. So in this case, what these researchers do, while they use population data to disaggregate the national GDP. So basically, by using population map, you can see how based on different national GDPs, you have different versions. So areas with high population density, low GDP, let's say like India, are empty out. In the second map, you see how Japan, for example, falls. But in any case, the question here is that in this map, overall, besides the differences that you can figure out within the spiky regions, you see a lot of regions that are basically producing nothing. Right? They are empty. They are void of economic activity. And of course it makes sense, because the way we count GDP, it has to do with the number of economic transactions. So obviously it's higher where they have densities, population, factors. But also this has created this idea that we have this world where cities are basically generating all social value. And we wanted to deconstruct that because this has been also at the heart of all these discussions around global cities, global networks that basically create this world of globalization where cities are basically floating in empty space. Right? So this is the famous 1970s model of John Friedman, network or globalizations from the globalization and the World City Network. That again, they map the world as a world where what matters is the relationship between cities. Right? And you can see, for example, the level of connectivity of these global cities. And of course, not only did these models erase a lot of growing cities from the global south from the map, right? But also they erased all the other landscapes, economic activity. So again, it somehow highlighted just the one side of the coin. And the second theoretical model that I'm going to discuss in my presentation is a way to go beyond that is to understand the production of value not just through human agents and human approach, but also through more than human agents and approach. And you can interpret that as a critical approach to ecosystem services, but it's actually really important to take this step and question this idea of ecosystem services basically. First of all, by saying services, it's supposedly suggests that natural systems are like services. Of course, it homogenizes also the way these services have actually contributed to human society. And this is an alternative model to that from critical environmental historical Jason, who suggests that if we want to understand the production, nature and production environment of society, we have to stop looking at paid work and labor. And of course, it's important that most of the narratives that we have of globalization, they have to do with very global distribution of paid work, meaning research for cheaper countries in the labor, right? Which of course happened. And this has been going on. But as this was happening, there was also a second surge across the planet for profit landscapes that didn't have to do with paid work of human labor, but with the unpaid work of mostly more than human entities. And you can actually start thinking what happens, for example, in agriculture, or forestry, or mining. So you have someone working there in the field, and you pay them or you exploit their labor. But you have definitely someone who you never pay. It's nature, it's the plants, right, that they are growing, it's the trees that they are growing, it's all the geological processes through which you have mineral resources, energy resources, right? So all these are kind of processes of more than human work, or work of nature, that we have been appropriated as signatures or as more concept ecological subjects. So basically, you can interpret this relationship between concentrated urbanization and extended urbanization not as a way to resolve rationally the metabolic needs of the fact that people are concentrated in cities, right? So we have resources, and somehow we have to find a way to resolve it. But as a way to treat the full planet as a profit landscape, right, or capitalist development through the appropriation, not just of human labor or exploited human labor, but also appropriated more than human labor. So what we did at the labor technology, my colleagues from the Material Lab, is we tried to invert a bit this idea that we have the spikes corresponding to activity. We invert a bit the model and say that the spikes are actually intimidations, right? They're holes in the ground, they're holes in the planet's surface, and the real value, the real spikes, are actually in this socio versions of even there's negative exclusions. So here GDP is seen as a negative exclusion, but the real value is actually produced in this spiky world of biomass production, crop, forestry, and economics. And mineral resources, and the last should be fishing. So in a way, this kind of inverts this idea of the spiky world, the human spiky world, and it gives you an idea of the more than human spiky world. Now, final point, and I will close with my presentation. There is an interesting theoretical hypothesis that Jason introduces. It basically says that this amount of ecological surplus, so this temperature that you can extract is not steady. It deteriorates the more you explore it. Right again, for example, of agriculture, you might say that at the beginning you go in a very fertile farm, you farm it again. The rate of farming actually starts exhausting the capacity of the soil, we should say. So then zero. You have to probably compensate for this loss of fertility, fertilizers with commodified inputs that you pay for. So something that was free before, it's not free anymore. And the very simple way to understand how this has been happening in relation to resources that are very much related to land systems, so agriculture, for example, resources selection, forestry, is to look at this very simple graph that shows you the rates of growth of population and of the used land of land. And you can see that both are positive. Of course, they are both the horizontal axis. But you can see that up to a point, population is growing, land use is expanding faster than population is growing, right? And it has to do with the relation of colonial systems, of exploitation of resources. But after a while, after the 50s, population keeps growing, land stops expanding so fast. Right? So it still expands, but much slower. And in a very simple way, you can even say that we are running out of land. Or you can basically create something like an Asian grid. This is fair kilometers. Right? You can see how many people are supported. So we have more and more people support per kilometer. And the way, the reason I want to go with this diagram is you can conceive as an intensification is that it could actually be a more interesting understanding of what urbanization is about, not the typical diagram that shows you urban and non-urban urbanization. It's actually a pattern of human urbanization of planet that creates this tendency to intensify land uses in support of these areas of concentrated urbanization. And this slide, which is an overlay of the previous spiking walls that they presented, could also be interpreted as a way to understand these landscapes of intensification. So, thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Nikos, por esta maravillosa presentación y nos deja a todos muy reflexivos entre distintos conceptos que manejaste sobre las fronteras, sobre la urbanización y lo rural, las concepciones que tenemos y los llenos, los vacíos, las interrelaciones de los sistemas. Vamos un poquito tarde en el orden, digamos, de las presentaciones, pero por favor, si tienen preguntas, mándenoslas, vamos a estarlas aquí recibiendo para después pasar al panel con, digamos, al debate con los panelistas que hoy nos acompañaron. Entonces, solo voy a esperar a que Nikos se ponga en el traductor, o I can say in English and then Spanish. Ah, se lo pone, perfecto. Para mí hubo un dato muy interesante, entre muchas otras cosas de lo que vimos hoy, Nikos, y justamente hoy, en una de las portadas de un periódico de circulación masiva en México, el Excelsior, una de las notas era que se alcanzó ya los 8.000 millones de personas que vivimos en ciudades, población urbana, y bueno, esto era algo que la ONU Habitat había predicho tiempo atrás, y no, ya sucedió, llegamos a ese día, y entonces aquí algo que a través de todos los mapeos que ustedes realizan fue muy evidente, es uno, lo que mencionaste, la urbanización no se termina en una frontera clara, sino todo lo contrario. El 3% de la superficie la ocupan las ciudades, sin embargo, utilizan el 70% digamos, más bien producen el 70% de las emisiones de CO2 a nivel global, ¿no? Eso solamente contando esa superficie muy pequeña. Entonces, algo que se evidencia claramente es la desigualdad en términos de producción, de explotación. Ustedes han llevado algún, digamos, estas orientaciones que te da de manera muy clara los mapeos hacia algún tema más político, como para impactar en la política pública o lograr generar una conciencia mayor, un llamado a la acción?
So yes, great points. I think you can always say whatever you use. The question is how specifically. Definitely, the closer, let's say, that this academic studies impact of policy information that we have to do for regional futures of regions. For example, I have been working in Europe. I have been working in cases that have required some music if you think that they are going to be the future of the regions. And they have this attitude that, you know, we have our cities, and we want the vision. And the premise was that we don't want to build up anything because it's already built up, and we want those agriculture. So if you start with this attitude, just to you don't really understand that, you know, if you stop building where eight and concept, then this overscale is going to happen where neighboring region or the region. So first of all, there is a scale question that helps you position all this. Obviously, it's hard to solve. But I think it helps position the argument beyond the typical meetings and buildings. Oh, we are the one developer, one infrastructure, the other, the conservative. You can have much more holistic approach to that. And I think there is no better example than arguing for counterintuitive approaches to sustainability, especially now in Europe, are becoming very micro. So in this competition, my immediate approach would be picking up. And you cannot really expect to preserve your existing landscape. And some other regions have undertaken or they develop. But then you start having issues like, oh, in every vision for the future, you have cars and those things. So again, have you really considered the broader footprint and the broader social implications of the green transition? And again, I'm not saying that, you know, if you just keep adding all this layers of complexity, you will be a better designer. Probably you, at some point, you will be somehow designed, and you will be like, what are we doing? But since whatever you propose, it's not going to be, you know, exactly implemented anyways, at least in this process, in large regional design visions, it's better to just put everything in so everything is visible. So decisions are revealed for what they really are. And people can take responsibility for their decisions and not really be able to somehow greenwash processes or pretend that they are well unaware of these secondary, tertiary, whatever you call them, not seeing these effects. I think it's a much more honest way of doing projects than to say that, you know, on the solution, it's not a zero carbon city. No, let's be honest, say there's no zero carbon city, there is always like a footprint you have to consider, this is the way everything will run. It's much more honest.
Muchas gracias, Nikos. Ahora invitamos a todos los ponentes, por favor, a que pasen al frente para continuar ahora con la mesa de discusión.
Okay, so when we were planning perdón, en español, cuando estábamos planeando el coloquio, teníamos una idea para cada una de las mesas. Y luego, bueno, nos enfrentamos con la realidad de la logística y tal, y acomodamos a los ponentes de la mejor manera que pudimos. Y mí me resulta muy interesante el contraste que vemos, primero con la presentación de Sara, haciendo énfasis en data, article, la información es gente, o la idea de humanizar la información. Luego con la presentación de Rasmus de Gell, con la idea de la metodología de poner a la gente primero, y luego con las presentaciones del doctor Krieger y del doctor Katsikis también, de Peter y de Nikos, hablando del antropoceno y hablando de la urbanización planetaria. Nos ofrecen unas visiones que yo veo hasta cierto punto venir del otro extremo, ¿no? de lo abstracto, de lo global o lo planetario. Y la manera en la que yo resumo este contraste es la cartografía centrada en la gente y las cartografías extra, o la cartografía centrada en el humano y las cartografías extrahumanas. Y a lo mejor para abrir la mesa de discusión, me gustaría preguntarles si ustedes han preguntado cómo se encuentran en un punto intermedio, es decir, cómo se complementa la información centrada en el humano con la información, la cartografía extrahumana, porque creo que de ambas partes hay una necesidad de, por ejemplo, por el lado de Nikos, llamar la atención al papel que juegan estas condiciones extrahumanas, pero también por el lado de Sara, llamar la atención a la necesidad que hay de humanizar la data y la cartografía. Entonces, por ahí va la pregunta, ¿cómo llegamos a un punto intermedio? ¿Cómo se complementan estas visiones? Gracias.
Yeah, I think what's maybe a common theme between those ideas is, you know, what is missing? Data. And I think what you're kind of highlighting in your talk is that we often look at data in one way, and so I think one of the things that I was advocating for is to turn data on its head, which is what you were doing in your project, right? In that looking at the opposite side of the data set is actually might be more telling, or a different way to understand the places that we live. So what isn't in the data speaks very loudly, right? And that we're not paying enough attention, we're not reporting it, we're not, what is missing is actually speaking to what we need to address now. So I loved how you flipped your data and said, what is it that we're missing, and how can we bring our attention to those needs? So I actually think it's almost very similar in a way, although what you're bringing attention to is like the lack of information on climate, the lack of thinking about climate in the same way that we are thinking about GDP. So I just think about the GDP of climate is, I think, really excited. So I think it's one way, you know, as cartographers and people working with data, we are often just map the data. We don't think about the way to kind of unravel that map and its power implications.
To me, what is interesting, and I try to stress it in the presentation, is the fact that this process of constructing, we haven't done any of that, sorry to talk about, but in our case, what was interesting was trying to get into the text, try to understand this process of constructing what were the themes, right? And I think if you start doing that systematically, you understand that there are a lot of conceptions about what is happening before you start studying this, before you start constructing data. And what is also very interesting is that in most cases, you are not able to get exactly the information that you want to describe the phenomenon. So I would say that all sorts of data are somehow process what we want to observe. I think also there's a regarding the more than human question, I just have a very fresh example from last week. And there is this company that apparently uses a lot of sensors to sense, what the plants are doing, what the cities are doing. And what we found really amusing was that the phrase that they use to somehow say to their product, oh, the plant is not happy if we know what it wants. So if you sense everything, temperature, how it reacts to light, you have all the sensors in the plant, then you make sure that you somehow respond what to do. So you can put it on, you solve the community with nature, on the plants. And it seems to be quite, funny. But it's like you consider that the same logic that you have for a thermostat in the house. You have electric problems. You construct the description of what the plant wants. So you now have a description of it. Well, it's actually means that you can start configuring all your agricultural systems. The second sensor are going to be configured once. And again, it's not what the plant wants. It's what you think once based on the logic of how you organize this domain. And I think we will start seeing more and more of these kinds of in-between approaches with some communities and nature. And if you also factor in a lot of this information and somehow AI, it's not really control how these are working basically. So it's like an intermediate kind of environment where sensing nature, but we think it's much better interpretation of nature finally. So it's not just description, it's something very rewarding, for example, and understanding what much people they find it fascinating. I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's going to get more and more interesting in terms of really losing track with the threshold between what we see is constructed as a symbolic environment and what it is actually what to do.
Bueno, no sé si puedo responder a la pregunta, pero tengo preguntas a mis colegas en la mesa, y es una pena que no está con nosotros Rasmus, porque la primera pregunta sería para él. Suena todo muy bien, los parámetros que menciona, ya conocemos que las actividades, nada contra eso, pero cuando él habló de measure life, y al mismo tiempo presenta proyectos en China, donde sabemos que en China es un país totalitario, donde tienen la policía internet más grande del mundo. Entonces, Measure Life tiene una connotación difícil en China, claramente, con la pandemia, con la política del lockdown, etc., aumentaron también los dispositivos de seguridad y control total. Entonces, ese Measure Life en ese sentido tiene como una connotación bastante preocupante. Y por el otro lado, en el mundo capitalista también tenemos como policías como Google, tú hablaste de esto, el poder totalitario, controlador de Google. También en muchas ciudades como Londres hay un sistema de vigilancia con cámaras, etcétera, enorme. Entonces, yo creo que lo que me falta un poco en este caso son las cartografías de conflictos, de las contradicciones, porque luego yo sé que él, vende proyectos y lo hace muy bien, pero luego suena demasiado bonito, porque sabemos también tristemente en una ciudad tan bella como Copenhague hay como conflictos racistas, grupos de extrema derecha, hay punks, hay de todo, ¿no? Entonces yo espero de una cartografía, digamos, analítica, también, digamos, la información de posibles conflictos territoriales, por ejemplo, lo que existe, ¿no? Si no suena un poco demasiado bonito. Y ahora la segunda para Sara me quedé muy impresionado con esa filmación de los autobuses en lagos, ¿no? Cómo buscan su camino. Y entonces, claro, es un caos, y en la mente, digamos, occidental eso es un problema, no es funcional, no es como ¿cómo se llama? La parada de autobús que diseña Eyal, todo bonito, fantástico, etcétera, es caos. Pero yo me pregunto por qué, digamos, es solamente negativo, tal vez es una creatividad. La manera en que el chofer del autobús busca su camino, y algo parecido tenemos en México, aquí también, con los microbuses, etcétera, es digamos, una ocupación territorial, es una coreografía de la vida cotidiana y no es malo en sí. Y ahí está el problema, digamos, de imponer una visión occidental en una, digamos, práctica etnográfica establecida. Y en lagos, por ejemplo, me acuerdo que la empresa Siemens en los 60 vendió un sistema de semáforos a lagos que nunca funcionó. Es una inversión enorme porque, digamos, ahí era el choque de sistemas, digamos, esa estructura no funcionó. Y entonces está muy bien tener como capacitar a los ciudadanos de lagos en esto, pero tengo también expreso mis dudas, si es como una imposición y, digamos, termina con una cultura que llamo ahora de manera, digamos, no tan académica, de caos creativo.
Yo quisiera aprovechar que tenemos este público tan diverso y un poco engancharme en la primera pregunta para ir hacia la segunda. Y yo creo que en ambas aproximaciones, una aproximación muy centrada en resolver problemas, en ver una mirada distinta y poner al centro a las personas, también tiene desde otra mirada teórica la actividad humana como centro de discusión. A lo mejor no es la persona, pero son las consecuencias de las actividades y de las acciones de muchas personas. Pero en ambos casos se comparten muchas líneas en común y yo veo temas que tienen que ver con la definición del poder o la demostración del poder en ambos casos, por ejemplo. Y algo que me pareció muy interesante fue, por un lado, es esta imagen en el tiempo que además te ayuda a partir de la cartografía o de herramientas como las que usa la doctora Williams, de poder hacer mapeos interactivos o que haya esta comunicación del proceso de apropiación. Por un lado está ralentizar, que decías tú tu exposición, doctor Krieger, de ralentizar la información y ponerla como en slow motion para que todos podamos como entender de qué va, de qué se trata. A lo mejor es una imagen fija o puede ser una serie de imágenes, y esto es una serie de datos de información que está tal vez congelada en el tiempo, aunque ahora hay muchas herramientas de mapeo que están constantemente nutriéndose y evolucionando, como el GTSF, ¿no? que está constantemente actualizándose. Y entonces lo importante de esto es la apropiación, es que esta información que se genera se la pueda apropiar un político, un senador, una senadora, que se la pueda apropiar tal vez un grupo de planificadores que están preocupados sobre el futuro de Lituania o el futuro de los Países Bajos, un grupo de activistas que está tratando de demostrar cómo la calidad del aire está afectando la vida de millones de personas. Entonces, si bien son aproximaciones distintas, yo creo que al final, en ambos casos, sí están las personas al centro, o la manera en la que intervenimos y extraemos, ¿no? A lo mejor de manera muy aborazada, ¿no? El entorno en el que vivimos. Entonces es desde la escala macro, lo planetario, hasta la escala micro, ¿no? En dónde me estoy conectando en Facebook desde mi celular y cómo esa información se está rastreando. Entonces, bueno, era más como una reflexión de los puntos en común que yo veía y de cómo a través de los distintos procesos que ustedes tienen, si es de manera consciente o no, la posible apropiación de este análisis de la información hacia sus públicos finales.
Yeah, maybe if I could start. I think it's quite interesting to consider that it was very obvious in this work that the data itself doesn't need to be in the community. You don't need to have representation of process for the map. Right? You can just use the information simply to see, reinforce this smart cities or smart plan without anyone ever knowing the patterns or the knowledge that is actually people. And I think to me this is the interesting part to understand what you do when you communicate and represent this information. I think in my case it's more a way also for me to understand what's happening. It's a bit like, what Mr. Fuller was suggesting, that there is a certain alignment in visualizing by reading the patterns. You generate some knowledge that if you don't know that, so if you are able to situate the patterns of the representation of the data. And to me that has been interesting. It has been something that is personally useful to my work. I don't know, to be honest, to what extent this is appreciated from the organization, but I use it in very specific ways to make very specific arguments. But how is that? I recognize it as a second position, and we need to be aware of that and highlight it.
I mean, I think what's interesting about what you're saying is, how do we give access of this information to the most people, right? And I think access is super important because, just to start, that having transparency of information is like the basis of the map system, right? Like to be able to see and understand and know we can act as civic actors in our space. So there are so many ways of knowing, and I think there is ways of knowing data and processes, but most people don't have that way of knowing. And today, I think art and representation and map, this panel we're on, is that important way of communicating and making information transparent to the public. And so, visualizing, whether it's visualizing the matatus or the colectivos or peceros, or allowing that way of knowing to exist provides so much benefit to society, but then also allows people to pick it up and use it for their own purposes. So I think one of the most exciting thing about almost all my projects is when somebody takes my map and uses it for something completely different. So like, for example, with the Tatu maps, people have used it to advocate for safety, gender safety, accessibility, new routes, kind of things that improve this civic society in Kenya that I had nothing to do with. And I think that is the power of representation, allowing us to do that. Even the government acquired it, the whole time we were working on that project, they were largely disinterested, but because we brought them in and then they saw how much power they could get out of it and looking good. And that's fine because it actually forced their hand to make more rules around the safety around the stops. Because the stops are very dangerous. The number one cause of death in Kenya is accidents, not matatus, but traffic accidents, and the matatus are a big portion of that. So, one thing that map is doing is actually allowing people to see where the stops are and see where they need to intervene and make those safer. But I think also in terms of like the migrant study also, making that data visible in a different kind of way, like putting it in the term of cost rather than flows, right? And understanding the mass amount of money that people spend and risking their life, instead of thinking about keeping them out or keeping them out of place. Or we often think of migration in terms of this flow, and it is a flow. But how do we address the risk in a different kind of way, so allowing us to know the data in a different way? But I guess that's what I'm advocating for as designers, is using our superpower, we are superheroes, for good rather than evil, and creating a different way of knowing and allowing for that dialogue, which I was thinking what was so interesting about some of the projects that you showed in terms of thinking about the terrain, having that in an exhibition, and then being able to have that dialogue, because I think it's not just the map, but it's also this exhibition where we can begin to open up new conversations around topics that are hard to enter into because they are so politically divisive.
Thank you, Sarah.
If I may add something to that, I think it's important also to acknowledge those, the power of elements in a way. Because no matter how transparent you are with setting your data and being very systematic, constructing metadata, doing applications around it, explaining actually what your intention was, what the logic, right? In the end, let's say that out of all this process, you have one very powerful image, and then this image circulates everywhere without the accompanying information around it, and it's used in all sorts of ways. My point is that the fact that you try to make sure that it's transparent, it's justified, it's somehow, supported by evidence, doesn't mean that the people on the other end will be able to digest that, or will actually have the time to go through that and understand what they would use, let's say, of image or not. So I think they power to candidate or whatever, but then at some point this responsibility, is very far away from what you can do. So it's to me it's a tricky question. How can you make sure that you cannot? There's always a chance that generate very strong representation of something that is used in a way that you will not intend.
Thank you, Nikos. We are almost catching up with our schedule, so I just want to share one last, perdón, ya casi estamos al día con nuestros tiempos, así que me gustaría compartir una reflexión final y tal vez escuchar de todos qué piensan. Lo que aprendí de las respuestas que dieron de la pregunta que hice es lo que tiene en común las diferentes aproximaciones es una idea de empoderamiento, una idea de que hay una vocación ética, como mencionó la doctora Williams, como mencionó Sara al final de su presentación, que también fue algo que me llamó la atención cuando Nikos, en respuesta a la pregunta que le hace Karina, dice, no lo sé, pero por lo menos estoy siendo más honesto, o la observación que hace Peter sobre la búsqueda de la identificación del conflicto. Siento que hay como un espectro, como de decir, hay que ser buenos, o hay que decir que no sabemos, o simplemente hay que identificar el conflicto y tal vez ni siquiera llegar a una conclusión. Más o menos lo entendí así. No sé si estoy haciendo una caracterización justa de las diferentes posturas, que creo que me parece central el tema de la ética, de lo que hacemos con el mapa, pero me encantaría escuchar sus pensamientos. Empezamos con...
Sí, gracias por este resumen. Estamos aquí en una facultad de arquitectura, entonces los que participan aquí, estudiantes, quieren saber cómo funciona la transferencia de diferentes tipos de cartografías a la práctica profesional. Tenemos dispositivos perfectos, digitales, etcétera, que la verdad ayudan mucho a la planeación, al desarrollo, pero otra vez quiero ser aplicados diaboli, insistiendo en la crítica digamos, cuestionar un poco, porque sabemos, digamos, si revisamos la historia de la cartografía, por ejemplo, el descubrimiento de los últimos lugares desconocidos en el siglo XVIII, sabemos lo que pasa con esos lugares. Se descubre todo, luego también se arruina todo, ¿no? Entonces, a veces, digamos, en un espacio libre, académico, tal vez en la Torre de Marfil, o sea como sea, entonces a veces hay que detenerse un poco en la reflexión, en la contemplación. Por eso también, digamos, expuse aquí la obra de arte como un espacio alternativo para repensar y, digamos, dejar un poco esa dinámica profesional, cotidiana, tenemos que planear todo, tenemos que ocupar todo. Entonces, la idea, digamos, de dejar espacios libres, no ocupar espacios y no como sobreponer con redes digitales y con otro tipo de cartografía todos los espacios, sino despedirnos, digamos, de esa ficción de un control total del mundo. Eso para mí es una conclusión.
Para mí, una de las reflexiones más potentes de hoy es que no existe neutralidad. En esto, la mirada ética también puede ser subjetiva, y entonces la cartografía es la representación de las subjetividades. Y cuando pensamos en hacer el bien o trabajar por el bien común, también le ponemos filtros, y esos filtros dependen de la mirada donde hayamos crecido, el contexto en el que vivamos, dónde estudiamos, qué nos enseñaron. Y en esta politización creo que también es muy importante tener la mirada de herramientas como lo es la cartografía para poder de alguna manera tomar fotografías en el tiempo de lo que está sucediendo, poder revelar distintos fenómenos, pero luego también sobreponerlos. A mí me parecía muy interesante esta reflexión que nos dabas, Paul, en donde la tecnomasa ya superó a la biomasa. Y después, viendo los mapas que tú mostrabas, Nikos, en donde el GDP lo ponías al revés, y entonces en lugar de que fueran estos picos que salieran, eran como estas extracciones del globo terráqueo, a lo mejor podría ser que el GDP ya superó, dependiendo de cuál sea la cuantificación que le demos, pero digamos la masa del globo terráqueo y la capacidad incluso de regenerarse por este pensamiento extractivista y de acumulación de capital y de desarrollo económico y de acumulación de población y de densidad y de querer controlar, y de pronto pues son como miradas distintas a lo mejor a problemas que podemos encontrar, estas intersecciones, que también creo que es una de los grandes valores que nos dan los mapas y los datos en general.
I think to me the ethics question is a quite elusive one, because in the end it has to do with the system of values, or shared values. That is very rarely the case. Right? So even if we want to think that we can do certain things, I think also recent events highlighted that even for very common sensitive things, there is no common set of values. And I think it's quite tricky if you want to justify what you're proposing based on to what extent reflects certain values that are shared, because after a point you realize that they are not shared. Right? Even things like climate change or green transitions, these are not necessarily priorities for the whole world. I think they are priorities for certain parts of the world. So to me it's a very elusive question. I think the advantage that we have as that people somehow associate with design disciplines is that we can always avoid this very strong ethical stance by saying that we are not really the ones that are offering very innovative solutions. But in the end, this is also a problem, because you cannot really validate what you're doing. You cannot really know if what you're doing has any societal value at all. Maybe that also explains why we're kind of marginalized, that disciplines, which in society, it's like economists and lawyers who to blame right now. But to me, this is tricky. For an engineer, it would be easy to validate what they're doing in design, by answering the question, does it work, does it not work? It's supposed to answer a very specific thing for them. not for integrating in society. Then integrating in society becomes a complicated issue. That is work for, who, right? But when you're designing like a fund, you don't really have to think, who is using the fund, how it's articulated, who benefits, blah, blah, blah. But if you're an economist, for example, you have to think about it. And then you have to somehow align yourself with certain sets of interests. So I think it's also dishonest if we want to present ourselves as the ones that are somehow claiming to do good in society as a whole. We are also doing good according to our sense of values that we feel ourselves with certain communities. Right? Not all of them. So.
Sure. I mean, I think my belief is like no data is neutral, as we talked about. Even the way it's collected or the way that I collected my data has a value proposition included in it. For what reason I collect it, or why, what am I going to do with it. And I think it's important for us to remember that there isn't a neutral data, right? And to explore the biases in your data set, and also explore your own bias, and also ask yourself why it is that you want to represent something, because sometimes when you ask yourself that question, you identify even maybe unethical questions you didn't know. Maybe it's a mysticism with the topic, or that can actually marginalize somebody or marginalize something. So ask yourself, why is it that you want to represent that information? But I think what's important to remember, and I like to say this all the time with data, it's just like a pen on a paper or paint on a paintbrush. How we use data is in the eye of the person who creates the results. So it's just another tool. I think you said a tool earlier. It's just like our pen or paper. And so what comes out always has the ethical values of the person who represents it, however hard they try to create a different representation. So it's up to us to evaluate the reasons people create cartographic. What are their motivations? And even that is an interesting exploration in power dynamics, and can start new dialogues and conversations that can create change too. When we see maps are so oppositional, and I'm thinking about these election maps that are happening right now, right? On the New York Times, everybody moving to Democrat, everybody moving to Republican. How are we moving? So think about the biases in those also, I ask you.
Tenemos unos reconocimientos para todos los ponentes y también un paquete con publicaciones de regalo por parte de la universidad. Me agradecemos mucho y les pido un aplauso fuerte.
Este documento dice así: la Facultad de Arquitectura de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, a través de su División de Educación Continua y Actualización Docente, otorga el presente reconocimiento a Sarah Milliams por su participación como conferencista magistral. Un fuerte aplauso, por favor. ¿Es solo un paquetito? Ahí van dos. Ahí va doble. Listo. Gracias. Muy bien, el siguiente, por favor. Este reconocimiento lo hacemos de manera simbólica, ya que no está con nosotros en este momento, para Rasmus Doung-Grunnet. Un fuerte aplauso para él, por favor. Este reconocimiento va para Peter Krieger por su participación como conferencista en este coloquio. Por supuesto, también agradecemos y reconocemos a Nikos Katsikis por su participación como conferencista. Muchas gracias. También reconocemos el trabajo de los moderadores de esta mesa, Agradecemos su participación como moderador y coordinador a Daniel Doung-Grunnet. Y por supuesto, también agradecemos la participación como comentarista a Karina Arbizu Machado. Agradecemos la presencia de todos ustedes a esta mesa.